If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, So I got reincarnated as a Weedle. No. Septal. Get up. Don't you lose to this hacker. Will shot up from the sofa, anxiously stomping his feet. The Pokémon, Diamond and Pearl series was playing on the TV. On screen, Ash's Septal had just managed to defeat a Darkrai, only to be instantly knocked out by a Latios that had just entered the battle. That legendary spamming trainer, Tobias, had only revealed his second Pokémon, while Ash had already lost 4. Alright, is he sending out Swellow? Yes. Take down that blue jet plane. Unleash that broken power from your home days and what they... Before Will could even finish his sentence, Ash's Swellow was one-shot and taken out. He felt the blood rush to his head. He staggered backward, collapsed onto the sofa, and everything went dark. When Will opened his eyes again, the world seemed to have gotten much bigger. Bzz. Wait, I think I'm the one who got smaller. Will tried to speak, but no human sounds came out. To his own senses, however, it sounded no different from his normal voice. He looked around and realized he was in some kind of forest. Not far away, he could hear the sound of flowing water. He tried to move toward the sound, but no matter how hard he strained, he couldn't seem to go anywhere. His body felt strangely disconnected. Will finally realized something was seriously wrong with his body and quickly looked down. But instead of his hands and feet, his face was practically pressed against the grass. What in the world have I become? Anxiously, Will tried moving in every way he could think of. He finally figured out how to move forward, wriggling. He could advance by wriggling his body, just like a worm. Will pushed through a bush and cautiously poked his head out to scan the area. He didn't spot any strange creatures, but up ahead, he saw what looked like a gigantic ocean. His eyes lit up. He quickly wriggled his way over to the edge and peered down at the water's surface. He finally saw his own reflection. A Weedle. Will's mind went completely blank. He couldn't believe it. He had become a Pokémon and a Weedle, no less, a creature at the absolute bottom of the food chain. Weedle is a bug/poison-type caterpillar Pokémon, commonly found in forests and grasslands. Its body is yellow-brown and segmented, with 7 pairs of pink, fleshy feet and a pink, nose-like feature on its face. It has a sharp, 2-inch stinger on its head and another barb on its tail. Its 2 small eyes were dark and glossy. A typical Weedle is about 0.3 meters tall and weighs around 3.2 kilograms. But the Weedle that was Will looked to be about half that size, as if he had just hatched from an egg. Weedle were already weak to begin with. In his current state, it was 100 times worse. It felt like any random Pokémon could show up and completely wreck him. Pidgey. Just then, a strange cry came from above. He strained to look up and saw a Pidgey flying overhead. Without a second thought, Will scrambled back into the bushes. Luckily, the Pidgey didn't seem to have seen him. This is bad, this is really bad. I have to evolve, fast. I won't have any way to protect myself until I become a Beedrill. Will hid in the bush, cautiously watching his surroundings. Right now, he was just an infant, a newborn Weedle. He couldn't even take on a normal Caterpie, let alone defend himself. Even after outgrowing the infant stage, he would only have a slight chance against other weak Pokémon. I wonder what my ability is. It would be great if I had a status screen or something. Feeling weak and powerless, Will lay limp in the bush. The short distance he had just wriggled seemed to have drained all his energy. He was now starving and exhausted. Just as he thought that, an interface panel materialized before his eyes. Weedle. Potential, white. Level, 1. Type, bug/poison. Ability, run away. Height, 0.15 m. Weight, 1.6 kilograms. Moves, poison sting, string shot. A real status screen. This is awesome. At least now I can get a handle on my situation. Will felt a small burst of energy as he studied his stats. As expected, he was pathetically weak. The only silver lining was having an excellent ability like run away. With this, no matter what enemy he faced, he would have a high chance of successfully escaping. I remember Weedle eat leaves. They're supposed to eat their own body weight in leaves every day. Will pondered for a moment, then sniffed the bush he was hiding in. It didn't have any strange smell, and his body's instincts were screaming with a desire to eat it. Well, if that's the case. Chomp, 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 chomp. Will devoured every leaf on the branch he was hiding behind, then moved to a neighboring bush. He was so full he could barely even wriggle. He had definitely eaten more than his own body weight. I need to grow up quickly. Evolve quickly. With that thought repeating in his mind, his eyelids grew heavy. A moment later, he collapsed and fell fast asleep. Rustle, rustle. He didn't know how much time had passed, but the sound of rustling bushes startled Will awake. He opened his eyes and looked toward the sound. In a bush not far from him, a caterpie was munching on leaves. That caterpie was enormous, easily twice the size of the stats Will remembered from the Pokédex. He had no idea how a caterpie could grow to be so massive. Regardless, Will didn't make a single sound. He just watched quietly as the caterpie finished its meal and crawled up a nearby tree. I see. His human mind was completely clueless about the habits of Pokémon. But after observing the caterpie's actions tonight, he had learned two things. First, moving around at night greatly increased the odds of survival. Second, it was best to sleep up in a tree. That would reduce the chances of being attacked by other Pokémon on the ground. Although there were more flying types in the trees, there were far more predators on the ground, making it much more dangerous for a weak creature like him. He glanced around, then turned and opened his mouth towards the leaves of his hiding spot. Chomp, chomp, chomp. He woke up again, and the sun was already bright. Will opened his eyes, feeling a bit thirsty. He needed a drink. He sleepily wriggled to the riverbank, lowered his head, and began drinking greedily. He was so focused that he didn't notice a Poliwag standing right next to him. The Poliwag was clearly also a newborn, and it stared curiously at the sleepy-looking Weedle. Mustering its courage, it hopped closer. Polly? Hello. The sudden sound from the Poliwag startled Will so badly that he almost face-planted into the water. Whose kid is this? Shoo, shoo. Will turned his head, shooing the other Pokémon away. He found that he could somehow instinctively tell the Poliwag's age. This one was probably a newborn, just like him. The caterpie he saw last night, however, was already an adolescent. Polly. The Poliwag left, looking heartbroken. It was very sad and decided to go find its mommy to cry. Will watched it leave, took a few more gulps of water, and then immediately turned to leave as well. He felt much safer hidden away in the bushes. It was time to get back to eating leaves. Different Pokémon species matured out of their infant stages at different rates. Dragon types, for example, took a very long time, while bug types matured incredibly fast. Will only remembered falling asleep about 5 or 6 times before he was finally past the newborn phase. His status screen had changed as well. Weedle. Potential, green. Level, 5. Type, bug/poison. Ability, run away. Height, 0.3 m. Weight, 3.2 kilograms. Moves, poison sting, string shot. Technically, his stats now matched those of a standard wild Weedle. In reality, however, he quickly discovered that wasn't the case at all. The Pokémon in this forest were all built like tanks. Every caterpie that passed by was at least twice his size and weight. He had no idea what kind of demonic forest he'd been born into. If he had the choice, Will would much rather be a normal trainer's Pokémon. At least then he wouldn't have to face this brutal survival of the fittest environment every day. But what trainer would ever want a Weedle as small and scrawny as him? I think it's been 3 days, and I haven't seen a single human. Will sighed from his hiding spot in the bush. He felt that the bush leaves weren't enough for him anymore. He needed something more nutritious to grow stronger. A normal wild Pokémon might be content with just having a full stomach, but very few would actively seek out specific nutrients to enhance their strength and physique. But Will, at his core, was human. I have to get up that tree. Will looked up. On the tree right in front of him hung several large, plump, red fruits that looked like apples. He remembered seeing them in the Pokédex before. They were called tangleberries, a fruit that concentrated 4 flavors: sour, sweet, bitter, and spicy into one rich taste. To be honest, back when he was human, he wouldn't have given such a bizarre fruit a second glance. But times were different. After days of eating bland, bitter leaves, Will was desperate for something with a more complex flavor. No sooner said than done. Will wriggled to the base of the tree and tried to climb it using his 7 pairs of small feet. Surprisingly, it was pretty easy. With all 14 feet working in unison, he actually managed to climb the tree. If I evolve into a Beedrill, I won't have to work this hard. I'll just be able to fly up. Will grumbled to himself as he wriggled upwards. Before long, he was already panting. He looked up and saw he still had a long way to go. Maybe I should have waited a few more days before trying this? Will was already thinking about giving up. He could clearly feel that he didn't have enough stamina to make it to the top. His feet were getting weaker and weaker, and he felt his grip loosening. Snap! One of his feet slipped, and Will tumbled backward. He wasn't too panicked, though. A fall from this height wouldn't kill him, it would just hurt a bit. Splat! Will squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact, but instead, he landed on something cool and soft. Polly. He opened his eyes and was met with the large, innocent eyes of the Poliwag. You again, kid? Still, you saved me this time. Thanks a lot. Will climbed off the Poliwag and looked it over. After 2 or 3 days, the Poliwag was still in its infant stage. It was only 0.3 meters tall, making it just a tiny bit shorter than he was now. Chapter 2, Recruiting an Ally. Polly. Hearing Will's words of thanks, the little Poliwag spun around happily on the spot. It then affectionately nudged up against the Weedle, rubbing against him gently. What are you doing all the way out here? Where are your parents? Be careful, or some other Pokémon will snatch you up and eat you. Will was a little worried, seeing such a tiny, young Pokémon wandering around alone in this massive forest. Of course, this concern was only because the Poliwag had just served as his personal cushion. Otherwise, he wouldn't have cared about its fate. He could barely ensure his own survival. Poliwag. The Poliwag explained its situation to Will. Oh, so your parents brought you out to find food. You're a lucky kid. You should get back to them. I'm going back into hiding. You should stop running around by yourself in the future. Knowing Poliwag's parents were nearby, Will stopped worrying. Poliwag. No, I'm not going. Polly. Don't ask why. Will refused the Poliwag's invitation. How could a lone Weedle like him possibly hang out with a family of Poliwag? Poliwag's parents were most likely Poliwhirl. The chances of them being a Politoed or a Poliwrath were slim. The former required a King's Rock and a trade to evolve, while the latter needed a Water Stone. Achieving those conditions in the wild was incredibly difficult. But regardless of which they were all frogs. And if you followed the natural food chain, frogs eat bugs. While Will had never seen a Pokémon eat another Pokémon in the anime, he had no idea what the reality was in this world. Polly. The Poliwag nodded and hopped away. A moment later, however, it returned, using its tail to carry a large pile of berries. It scurried over and placed them in front of the bush where Will was hiding. Poliwrath. A powerful, booming call echoed from the distance. The moment the Poliwag heard the sound, it quickly turned and rushed back. It seemed his parents were calling for him. After the Poliwag was gone, Will poked his head out. He glanced in the direction the Poliwag had left, then looked down at the small mountain of berries in front of him. He felt a little touched. That baby Poliwag was actually pretty kind. Will crawled out of the bush and began to ravenously devour the various berries. Sweet and sour ones. Sweet and spicy ones. Sour and bitter ones. A mix of sour, sweet, bitter, spicy, and dry. It didn't matter. He loved them all and ate everything he could, stuffing himself without hesitation. Just as he was about to finish, another Weedle, covered in wounds, wriggled out from a nearby bush. It looked like it had been attacked by another Pokémon. This Weedle was quite large, at least 1.5 times Will's size. Help me. The Weedle spotted Will, a glimmer of hope in its eyes as it let out a plea for help. It was already lying flat on the ground, too weak to move. If Will did nothing, this Weedle would die right here. Will looked reluctantly at the remaining pile of berries, gritted his teeth, and carried a few over to the injured Weedle. He remembered that these specific berries helped restore stamina. The injured Weedle gave Will a grateful look and weakly lifted its head to nibble on the fruit. Worried that this stranger might recover and try to steal the rest of his food, Will quickly went back and finished the remaining berries until he was completely stuffed. He couldn't help it, he had to be cautious. After all, this Weedle was clearly stronger than him. But Will had miscalculated one thing. Pokémon weren't as malicious as humans. Why would they ever turn on their own savior? Will watched as the other Weedle, after finishing the berries, found a bush to curl up in and sleep. Reassured, Will found his own safe spot and dozed off. When he woke up, his eyes shot open in shock. The Weedle he had saved was resting right beside him. The proximity gave Will a huge scare. However, seeing that the other Weedle showed no hostility, he breathed a sigh of relief. After observing for a while, he realized it was probably protecting him while he slept. I slept too soundly. I didn't even notice it get this close. What's your name? Will asked the Weedle. He figured wild Pokémon probably didn't have names, but he asked anyway. It was his first time being a Pokémon, so who knew if they had their own names or call signs? I don't have a name. Want to team up with me from now on? Will wasn't surprised by the answer and immediately extended an invitation. The Weedle nodded, a happy expression on its face, and leaned in, touching the horn on its head to Will's. It had always been alone and lonely, so it was happy to have found a companion. Alright, we'll need call signs then. You can call me Will. As for you, I'll call you Wally. Looking at the Weedle before him, Will understood its gesture and touched his horn back. He noticed that this Weedle's body color was a bit paler than a typical Weedle's, which gave him the idea for the name. As for why they touched horns? It was a Weedle's way of showing friendship. Okay, Will. Can you climb trees? Will asked. He figured a Weedle of Wally's size should be able to climb. Sure enough, Wally nodded, then looked at Will with a puzzled expression. He remembered being able to climb trees since he was born. Could it be that Will couldn't? Come on. Let's finish those berries, then get up that tree. You can carry me, I don't have enough strength. Okay. Wally nodded. Will then led Wally to finish off the rest of the berries the Poliwag had brought. Afterward, they once again challenged the Tangleberry tree. This time, however, things were different. Will climbed in front, while Wally stayed right behind him, pushing on his rear end, which saved him a lot of effort. Finally, Will reached the top of the main trunk and got his first look at life in the canopy. You'd never know it from the ground, but it seemed like every single tree in this forest was home to some kind of bug Pokémon. On a nearby tree, for instance, sat a fat Caterpie. And on their very own tree, there was another Weedle, about the same size as Wally. Will, should we fight it? After reaching the top, Wally also saw the nearby Weedle, which was staring back at them warily. Will thought for a moment, looking at Wally, then at the other Weedle. He then carefully observed the situation on the other large trees in the area. He began to understand what was going on. Territorial instincts. One bug Pokémon claimed a single tree, treating the tree and all the berries on it as its personal property. Wally's question was essentially asking Will if they should try to take over this one's territory. Not yet. Let's watch first, Will shook his head after some consideration. Small Pokémon like Caterpie and Weedle didn't have very high intelligence. They lacked the concept of teamwork and only thought about hoarding resources for themselves. It wasn't until they evolved into Butterfree or Beedrill that they developed a sense of community. But Will didn't have to wait until he was a Beedrill to build his own faction. He could start a small Weedle squad right now. With that in mind, Will wriggled toward the unfamiliar Weedle. Hello. Go away. Will was taken aback when he heard its voice. In his ears, it sounded distinctly female. This Weedle was a girl. We can work together. We can take over all the big trees in this area. Go away. Wally, attack her. Will figured the other Weedle was too stressed to communicate properly. So, he decided that he and Wally would team up and teach her a lesson to help her calm down. Twee. Will tried to spit, but instead, a long, thin thread shot out and ensnared the other Weedle. She immediately retaliated, shooting a stream of silk back at Will, but he easily dodged it by backing up. Meanwhile, Wally had already charged forward, sinking his jaws into the other Weedle's head. Bug bite. Wally's level must be pretty high. Why hasn't he evolved yet? Will thought with some surprise. A Weedle could only learn 3 moves, the innate poison sting and string shot, and the learned move bug bite, which was typically acquired around level 9. Generally, a Weedle at that level was already in the range for evolution. The opposing Weedle was clearly a lower level than Wally, and she was being double-teamed. She was quickly defeated. Finally, she lay on the branch in despair, quietly waiting for the 2 strangers to either kick her off the tree or eat her. Can you listen to me properly now? Will had no intention of eating her. He just moved closer to talk. What do you want to say? Join our team. From now on, you'll have lots and lots of berries. And you won't be bullied by others anymore. Will thought for a moment and decided to put it in simpler terms. Really? The female Weedle's eyes lit up, and she looked like she was about to drool. Really? Will nodded. With that, the Weedle immediately stopped resisting and nodded to show she was willing to join Will's little team. Alright, let's start over. I'm Will, this is Wally. You need a name too. Let me give you one. Okay. Your name will be Millie. Will stared at the female Weedle for a moment. He noticed that her small eyes and the horn on her head were rather delicate. While he wasn't exactly an expert on Weedle aesthetics, he felt that she was probably quite pretty among her kind, so he gave her the name Millie. Okay. Millie nodded, then moved closer and touched her horn to theirs. Will and Wally both lowered their heads to complete the gesture. The three of them were now a small group, a team of companions. For the next few days, we're staying on this tree. Eat as much as you can. Eat all the berries on this tree. Don't waste your appetite on leaves, focus on the fruit. When we're done, we'll go take over another bug's territory. Okay. They both chirped. Under Will's leadership, the three bugs began to frantically munch on the tangleberries. The tree was loaded with fruit, and it would take their three small bodies at least 10 days to finish them all. But an unexpected change happened much sooner. That very night, Wally's body began to glow with a brilliant white light. Millie was startled and hid behind the much smaller Will. When the light faded, Wally had transformed into a cocoon. A Kakuna. Kakuna are yellowish, cocoon-like Pokémon with a domed head and black, triangular eyes. In the middle of its body are scythe-like arms. Although Kakuna only has the defensive move Harden in the games and seems to have no offensive capability, that wasn't the reality here. Despite being a cocoon, it could still move its body slightly. If an enemy approached, it would extend its stinger to attack. Wally? Millie asked uncertainly, looking at the big, yellow object before them. Yeah, that's Wally, Will confirmed. But compared to Millie's uncertainty, Will was feeling something much more profound, shock. A normal Kakuna was only about 0.6 meters tall. Wally had already been 0.5 meters tall as a Weedle. After evolving, he was now a full meter tall. This wasn't a Kakuna, this was a giant, sharpened cone. Just what kind of forest is this? Will looked out at the boundless forest in a daze. He was starting to realize that every single Pokémon in this place had a physique that completely defied everything he knew. Author's note. To my dear readers, after you finish the chapter, please comment, review and vote to help with the story's engagement. Thank you so much. Chapter 3, Claiming Territory. How long does it take for a Kakuna to evolve? I remember them saying in the anime that a Metapod only needs about 7 days to store enough energy to evolve into a Butterfree. It should be about the same for a Kakuna. Will stared at the enormous Kakuna that was once Wally. Once a Weedle evolves into a Kakuna, there's less need to worry about being hunted by bird Pokémon. Small birds like Pidgey would never be able to bother a Kakuna. And while Pidgey's evolutions, Pidgeotto and Pidgeot, could easily hunt a Kakuna, they usually wouldn't choose one as prey because it was too much effort to eat. Still, just in case, I should probably hide Wally for now. Millie, go get some leaves. Having made up his mind, Will immediately began giving orders to Millie. The two Weedle spent the first half of the night gathering huge leaves. They then used their string shot to paste the leaves all over the Kakuna's shell. With that, no one would be able to tell Wally was there. They slept soundly through the second half of the night, not waking until nearly noon the next day to eat their fill. I need to find more followers. After seeing Wally evolve, Will decided to change his plans temporarily. Originally, he had intended to finish all the fruit on their current tree before moving on to the next one to claim more territory. But now, it seemed he had to change the order of operations. Will needed more allies to protect him when he eventually evolved into a helpless Kakuna. Given the bizarre and dangerous nature of this forest, one Kakuna and one Weedle were definitely not enough. Besides, he had a feeling that he and Millie were only a day or two away from evolving themselves. Caterpie and Weedle were known for their rapid evolution. After leaving their infant stage, it typically took less than 10 days for them to reach their next stage, making them the fastest evolving Pokémon. And that was just for those who grew up eating ordinary leaves. For a Weedle like Will, who had been feasting on nutritious berries, the process would only be faster. If all three of them evolved into Kakuna, and a hungry Pidgeotto or Pidgeot happened to pass by, it absolutely wouldn't mind putting in a little extra effort for a big meal. Millie, let's go. We're going to find some of our kind. Are we going to eat them? Millie asked, sounding somewhat excited. No. We're going to win them over. Will looked at Millie with a sense of helplessness. When he watched the anime, he never thought the Pokémon world was so cruel. Natural enemies were one thing, but he didn't think the same species would resort to eating each other. But from what he was seeing now, there was zero trust between Pokémon. They were even thinking about cannibalism. Something was definitely wrong with this world. Millie let out a noncommittal buzz, seemingly not understanding what Will was talking about. Still, she followed behind him. To be honest, without the powerful Wally by his side, Will felt a little insecure. His own level was decent, a solid LV7, and his body had surpassed the average Weedle height of 0.3 m. But in this forest, that height was practically a disability. Wally's pre-evolution height of 0.5 m was what passed for normal here. Millie was a bit smaller than Wally but stronger than Will, at 0.45 m, but even she was on the weaker side. Even if the two of them teamed up, they weren't guaranteed to beat another strong bug. The two of them slowly made their way down from the tree to the grass below. Will, look. The moment they hit the ground, Millie let out a wary cry. Will immediately whipped his head around, but relaxed when he saw who it was. What are you doing here again? Will stopped Millie, who was preparing to attack the baby Poliwag. Polly, I wanted to play with you, the Poliwag chirped, wagging its tail happily. We don't have time to play with you. And stop running out of your nest by yourself. You need to stay with your parents, you hear me? Will scolded the Poliwag sternly. They were too weak right now. They didn't have the luxury of playing games if they wanted to survive. And he wasn't wrong, this Poliwag hadn't even outgrown its infant stage, yet it dared to run around so freely. It clearly had never experienced the harsh realities of the world. If he hadn't stopped her just now, Millie probably would have killed it. If he had been born into such a privileged situation, he would have definitely stayed glued to his parents' side until he evolved into a Poliwrath before even thinking about exploring. Wah! The Poliwag ran away, crying. Will sighed and shook his head, a pang of guilt in his heart. He felt that only by using such a harsh tone would the little newborn listen to him. If he were just a bit stronger, a Beedrill perhaps, he might have been willing to play with the little guy for a while. That Pokémon just now was my friend. If you see it again, don't bully it. Oh, Millie responded, sounding bored. Next, Will led Millie to a neighboring tree. He discovered that this time, he was able to climb to the top all by himself. I'm getting stronger. The feeling was crystal clear, giving Will even more motivation to grow. Reaching the main trunk, he and Millie scanned the area but didn't spot any Weedle. They did, however, find a Caterpie that was about 0.5 m long. A bug of that size was probably on the same level as Wally before he evolved. Can a Weedle and a Caterpie be on the same team? Will wondered. From his human perspective, the habits of Weedle and Caterpie were similar enough that forming a team shouldn't be a problem. Besides, in the anime, Ash's Pikachu lived with a group of Kangaskhan when he was just a Piku. Millie, would you want it to join our team? Still, just to be safe, Will asked Millie, who was a real Weedle. No. Enemy. Millie's attitude was firm, her hostility towards the Caterpie palpable. It wasn't just her, the Caterpie on the other side felt the same way. Now Will understood. For most Pokémon, only their own kind could join their clan. They could become friends with other species, but never family. In fact, even becoming friends was probably difficult. The Pokémon of this world were incredibly wild and aggressive, especially those who grew up alone. Only naive, infant Pokémon like the baby Poliwag would recklessly approach other species. Attack it! Recognizing this reality, Will didn't waste any more words. He and Millie immediately charged forward to swarm the Caterpie. They used the same strategy as before. Will harassed and trapped the Caterpie from a distance with string shot, while Millie moved in to deal damage with poison sting. Although the Caterpie was larger, 2-on-1 was too much for it, and it was quickly defeated. From this moment on, this tree was their territory. Wait! Millie, what are you doing? Suddenly, Will saw Millie happily approaching the unconscious Caterpie and called out to her in alarm. Eating it, of course. Will was stunned. He opened his mouth to protest but ultimately remained silent, unable to say the words to stop her. He realized that what was unacceptable to him might be perfectly normal in Millie's eyes. Perhaps this was simply the law of nature in this forest. Besides, if eating the Caterpie would speed up Millie's growth, it would also increase their overall chances of survival. It would be beneficial for both her and him. Chapter 4, A Weedle's Path to Power. Will did not watch the process of Millie eating the Caterpie. The mental image alone was beautiful enough, he didn't dare to see it for real. I think I might finally know what the deal is with this world. Will stood alone on a branch, a single bug gazing thoughtfully at the distant lake. Based on his observations over the past few days, he had discovered many differences between this Pokémon world and the one he knew. To put it simply, this was a dark version of the Pokémon world. Not only did Pokémon eat each other, but every single one of them had a physique that far exceeded the average stats listed in the Pokédex. There was one other thing. This forest was absurdly lush, as if he were in a prehistoric age. He hadn't noticed it before, but now, using his own height as a reference, he realized that even the shortest trees nearby were over 10 meters tall, with trunks at least 5 meters in diameter. In his past life on Earth, that might not have seemed like much, but this was the world of Pokémon. In the anime, the trees were rarely tall, typically around 5 or 6 meters at most, with many being even smaller. Based on all the evidence, an idea began to form in Will's mind. Was it possible that he had indeed arrived in the world he knew, but not during the peaceful era of leagues? Could he be in the war-torn era of primal beasts? Or perhaps even the more distant ancient age? The primordial age of chaos seemed impossible. From what he had seen so far, Will believed the era of primal beasts was the most likely. After all, he had seen tangleberries in the games before, a fruit that existed in the era of leagues. The ones here looked exactly the same, and it was unlikely they would have remained unchanged for millions of years since the ancient age. If this is the era of primal beasts, then everything makes sense. Will drew his gaze back and looked behind him. Millie had finished her meal and was now lying on a branch with her eyes closed, apparently settling in for an afternoon nap. Seeing this, Will ate his fill of berries from their tree, then covered himself with a couple of leaves and went to sleep. The life of a Pokémon was just that simple. Eat, sleep, repeat, all on the path to growing big and strong. But when Will woke up again, he felt like his world was collapsing. Millie had also evolved into a Kakuna. This meant that his 3-bug squad was once again a 1-bug squad. Just as Will was debating whether he should go out alone to recruit more followers, a skinny Weedle came struggling up the tree, panting for breath. When it reached the top and saw another Weedle and a Kakuna already there, it jumped in fright. But it was too exhausted to climb back down, a fall from this height would be fatal. Having no other choice, the skinny Weedle adopted a battle stance, trying to intimidate Will. But its body was trembling, betraying its fear. A height of only 0.35 m. In the era of primal beasts, this has to be a case of severe malnutrition. In the week he had been in this world, this was the first time Will had ever seen a Weedle weaker than himself. Well, even a mosquito is still meat. An evil smile spread across Will's face as he looked at the weak little Weedle. 1 minute later, Will had gained another bruised and battered follower. He bestowed upon him the name, Frost. The reason was simple, the weak Weedle had a big, hard stinger on its head, but the stinger was pure white. After some investigation and questioning, Will discovered that Frost had a very low level of poison in his system. This was likely because his diet had consisted almost entirely of ordinary bush leaves. While bush leaves were easy to find everywhere, they contained far fewer trace toxins than tree leaves and were not effective for accumulating poison energy. This was a revelation for Will. No wonder the Pokédex and a Weedle's own instincts pointed towards eating leaves. It was to absorb the trace amounts of poison within them to strengthen their poison-type abilities. While eating fruit was more nutritious and accelerated physical growth, it did little to develop their poison attribute. Frost had been too weak and lacked the stamina to climb trees, so he could only survive by eating bush leaves on the ground, just as Will had in the beginning. The fruit on this tree, eat as much as you want. Thank you, Will. Hearing Will's words, Frost was so moved that tears streamed from his eyes. He cried as he chomped down on a sweet, juicy tangleberry. In his mind, he couldn't yet grasp the concept of being a comrade. He only knew that this was Will's territory, yet Will was willing to share the food from it. He was therefore incredibly grateful. From now on, whoever Will told him to fight, he would fight. Will paid no mind to Frost's tearful gratitude. Instead, he was busy planning the future configuration of his squad. He now understood the two distinct paths to power for a Weedle. One path was to eat fruit. Following this path was like being a warrior class in a fantasy novel. Their bodies would grow exceptionally strong, they would have greater physical strength, their physical attacks would be more powerful, and they would be much tougher. The other path was to follow their instincts and consume leaves, or even poisonous substances. This was like being a magic class, accumulating poison energy within the body to enhance poison-type damage. For wild Pokémon, the first path was clearly more suitable for survival. Most Pokémon judged strength by size, the bigger you were, the more likely you were to scare off an opponent. This was especially true for a Pokémon like Beedrill, which was known for its physical attack and speed. Beedrill was by no means weak, its stats were allocated like a glass cannon's. Trying to make a Beedrill a balanced fighter would be missing the point entirely. The reason wild Beedrill weren't very strong in single combat was likely because, without a trainer's guidance to make smarter battle decisions, they had followed the wrong path, using leaves as their primary growth material. From now on, the entire squad eats berries. Will made his decision. He would lead his followers to become the overlords of this part of the forest, monopolize a huge grove of berry trees, and raise a demon muscle bee swarm. His strategic planning was complete. It had used up a lot of brain power. Chomp, 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 chomp. After eating, Will lay down and went to sleep alongside Frost and the Kakuna that was Millie. When he woke again, it was already evening. Millie and Frost were still asleep beside him. Will felt that he had grown a little taller, and there was a strange energy welling up inside him, ready to erupt. Let's check the status screen. Weedle. Potential, White. Level, 8. Type, Bug/Poison. Ability, Run Away. Height, 0.45 m. Weight, 4.5 kilograms. Moves, Poison Sting, String Shot. I really am a chunky little worm. Will looked at his height and weight and nodded with satisfaction. He had finally made up for some of his initial weakness. While he hadn't quite caught up to the average, he wasn't far off. Is this feeling the prelude to evolution? No, not yet. Frost is too weak. He can't guard me by himself. Will suppressed the surging feeling within him. The urge wasn't too strong yet, he could still hold it back. He decided to accumulate more power and try to reach the average size for his species before evolving. That way, after passing through his Kakuna stage, he would emerge as an average-sized Beedrill. Chapter 5, Evolution. An evolution again. After Frost woke up, Will took him to a nearby tree where they found and persuaded another Weedle to join them as a partner. The newcomer was named Rusty. The reason was that the yellow-brown parts of this Weedle's body were very dark, appearing almost deep brown. In terms of size, he was about 0.4 m, a little taller than Frost. Will was starting to figure things out. The bigger Weedle were generally higher level and already on the verge of evolution. If he evolved into a Kakuna, these larger Weedle would likely follow suit soon after. At that point, no one would be able to protect anyone else, they would just be a bigger, more conspicuous target for other Pokémon. But since Frost and Rusty were both relatively small, they still had some time before they were ready to evolve into Kakuna. That was one thing he didn't have to worry about. I can't hold it back anymore. I have to prepare to evolve. Will led Frost and Rusty up another tree. The surging feeling inside him was becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. He didn't have time to find more followers to stand guard, he needed to quickly build a safe and hidden nest. He had them gather a large number of leaves on the tree, piling them into a mound. Then, after stuffing himself with berries until he was full, he crawled into the leaf pile. Frost, Rusty, I'm about to evolve. For the next few days, stay on this tree. Remember, don't let any other Pokémon get close. As soon as Will finished speaking, his body began to glow with a brilliant white light. Within the light, his form gradually began to change. Finally, Will transformed from a yellow-brown caterpillar into a pale yellow cocoon. Thanks to the covering of leaves, his evolution didn't cause any major disturbances in the forest. Although Frost and Rusty didn't understand what Will meant by evolve, they had watched with their own eyes as he changed form. They knew that the large cocoon buried beneath the leaves was their boss. Frost and Rusty looked at each other, ate some berries from the surrounding branches, and then curled up to sleep around the leaf pile. Time seemed to slow down. The world suddenly became much quieter. Beneath the leaves, Will couldn't see the outside world, which forced him to focus all his attention on his hearing. He heard Frost and Rusty munching on berries. He heard some kind of four-legged creature running past on the ground below. He heard what sounded like a bird landing in the canopy above for a brief rest. Polly. A familiar sound echoed nearby. Ah, he's here again. He just won't listen. Unsure how much time had passed, Will's drowsy consciousness instinctively thought of the Poliwag. He knew the kid must have wandered off again and come here looking for him. Unfortunately, his body now felt hot and heavy, and he had no desire to move at all. He closed his eyes and sank back into a deep sleep. Will completely lost his sense of time. At first, he could still open his status screen to take a look now and then. Kakuna. Potential, green. Level, 9. Type, bug/poison. Ability, shed skin. Height, 0.9 m. Weight, 18 kilograms. Moves, harden. Evolution increases potential, and my height and weight are far above average. Excellent. By analyzing and thinking about his status screen, he could barely maintain his sense of self. But as more and more time passed, being motionless in total darkness while his body grew progressively hotter, his consciousness began to blur. Eventually, he even stopped thinking, simply waking up in a daze each day before falling asleep again. It wasn't until the feeling of something about to erupt from within his body returned that his mind was jolted back to clarity. Another flash of white light. Will felt his body become incredibly light. He had limbs again, and he could even feel something on his back that he could control. Crash! Will shot to his feet, forcefully throwing off the pile of leaves that had been pressing down on him. Check status. Beedrill. Potential, blue. Level, 10. Type, bug/poison. Ability, swarm. Height, 1.8 m. Weight, 55 kilograms. Moves, fury attack, bug bite, poison sting, string shot, harden. My potential increased again, and these stats are just ridiculous. Feeling this familiar perspective, Will couldn't help but smile. In his previous life as a human, he had been about 1.8 meters tall. It felt incredibly natural to return to this height. In the era of leagues, the average height of a Beedrill was only 1 meter. He was nearly twice that. Out in the wild, this would make him an alpha-class Beedrill, but in this forest, it was probably just about average. Frost. Rusty. Will remembered his two followers and looked around for them. With a turn of his head, he immediately spotted two Kakuna staring silently at him from nearby. Although their forms had changed, Will recognized his two underlings at a glance. Will moved closer to inspect them. He determined that the two of them must have just evolved into Kakuna not long ago. He had learned from his own experience how to tell how far a Kakuna was from evolving again, you just had to touch it and feel its temperature. As a Kakuna accumulated more and more energy, its body temperature would rise. When it reached a certain point, it meant evolution was imminent. Frost and Rusty blinked their eyes. Their gazes were full of adoration, they thought Will looked incredibly cool. And while Beedrill's design might not be T0 or T1, it could definitely squeeze into the T2 tier of cool-looking Pokémon. You two just stay here and evolve at your own pace. I'm going to look for our other two companions. Will gently touched Frost and Rusty with his hands, which had now become two thick, white stingers, and then ran to the edge of the branch. He could no longer climb down like he did as a Weedle. There was only one option left for him. To fly. How do I fly? Will glanced back at the two pairs of wings on his back. He tried to control the muscles there, and the next moment, he was floating unsteadily in the air. It was a flight memory imprinted on his very being. However, his human memories were more numerous and profound, which had made the instinctual Beedrill memory of flight feel faint. Will could only slowly excavate this instinct. After about 5 minutes, Will felt he had the hang of it. He controlled the slow, steady beat of his wings and flew down from the tree. His speed was probably slow, but he was very stable, unlike his initial wobbly attempts where he couldn't keep his balance. He was confident that with another hour or two of practice, he would be able to fly freely. He first flew to the large tree where Wally had been, but he couldn't find any sign of him. This made him frown with a hint of anxiety, worried that Wally might have been eaten by some other Pokémon. However, when he arrived at the tree where Millie had been, he was relieved. It turned out that after Wally had evolved into a Beedrill, he had flown off in search of Will. When he couldn't find him, he had decided to stand guard over their other companion, Millie. And now, both Wally and Millie had become Beedrill. Chapter 6, The Boss's Spoiled Kid. The squad Will had assembled now numbered 5. Besides Will himself, there were Wally and Millie, the 2 other Beedrill, as well as Frost and Rusty, who were set to evolve within the week. A small team of 5 Beedrill was still far from being considered a proper swarm, but it was the beginning of one. In this primal forest, while they weren't exactly overlords, they had at least earned the right to claim a small piece of territory as their own. And Will was the king of this territory. He assessed his subordinates' strength. Wally, as always, had evolved into a massive Beedrill, standing at 1.9 meters, 0.1 meters taller than Will. In their current 5-member squad, Wally was, without a doubt, the strongest fighter. And unlike the other 3, who had been beaten into submission, Will had saved Wally's life. Even if someone tried to usurp his leadership in the future, it would never be Wally. In fact, any usurper would have to get through Wally first. This meant that the strongest member of his team was also his most trusted companion. Millie, on the other hand, seemed to have shrunk proportionally. She was only 1.6 m tall, 0.2 m shorter than Will. However, her good looks were even more pronounced. Her orange-yellow exoskeleton was bright and vibrant, her 2 large, round eyes were a striking pink, and the black stripes on her body were sleek and glossy. Although Will couldn't fully appreciate it, judging by the way Wally kept stealing glances at her, he determined that Millie was definitely a beauty among Beedrill. As for Frost and Rusty, he would have to wait until they evolved to see what they became. Let's go. We'll check out the area near the lake. Will waved a stinger, leading Wally and Millie away from the tree. He could fly now, and he had a squad of 3. He didn't dare fly too high to pick fights with the bird Pokémon after all, the 3 of them were only around level 10. But flying low to scout the surrounding terrain should be no problem. Under Will's lead, the 3 Beedrill flew forward at a low altitude. They maintained a safe distance from the grass below, while the dense canopy above shielded them from the open sky. The safety factor was high. Being able to fly is so much better. Will couldn't help but marvel inwardly. He remembered when he was a Weedle, not only was he weak, but his movement speed was painfully slow, limiting him to a tiny area. Now, he could finally explore a little further. Achaons. Just as they were approaching the lake, a threatening cry suddenly erupted from the forest nearby. Come on, let's check it out. Will's interest was instantly piqued. He led Millie and Wally and flew quickly in that direction. After flying for a dozen or so meters, his expression changed dramatically. A massive Achaons, nearly 3.5 meters long, had cornered a Poliwag and a Sandshrew. Achaons were commonly found in grasslands, hiding deep in the vegetation, and their bodies grew continuously with age. The average Achaons in the era of leagues was only 2 meters long. He had no idea what the average was in this era of primal beasts. But it was clear this one was a huge threat. Attack that snake! Without a second thought, Will led Wally and Millie in an assault on the Achaons. He didn't recognize the Sandshrew, but the Poliwag was clearly the same baby he had met days ago. Although it had now outgrown its infant stage, its level was still very low. It was no match for such a colossal Achaons. Poison Sting X3. The 3 Beedrill simultaneously fired their stingers from a distance. They had the natural advantage in the air, there was no need to go down to the ground to fight the Achaons. While Will knew that a poison-type move like Poison Sting wouldn't be very effective against a fellow poison type, his goal wasn't to defeat it. He first wanted to see if he could scare it away. Hiss! The Achaons recoiled, dodging the volley of stingers. It stared up at the 3 Beedrill with its sinister yellow eyes, hesitated for a moment, and then turned and disappeared into the tall grass. The Poliwag and Sandshrew trembled as they looked up at the 3 intimidating Beedrill. They felt like they had just escaped a danger to fall into any other bigger danger. Will signaled for Wally and Millie to stay put while he descended alone in front of the Poliwag and Sandshrew. Both of them were small creatures, only about 0.6 m tall. In the era of leagues, that would be an average height, but in this era of primal beasts, they were clearly just little kids who had barely matured. Why are you running around all over the place again? Polly. Hearing Will's voice, the Poliwag froze, then its face filled with shock. It couldn't possibly imagine that the tiny bug who was once its size had now become such a tall and mighty Pokémon. What are you so surprised about? Is this your friend? Poliwag. No longer afraid, the Poliwag quickly introduced the Sandshrew beside it to Will. He's from the territory next door. Will raised an eyebrow. He noticed that the Poliwag seemed to have gotten a little smarter after maturing. It actually understood the concept of territory now. The Poliwag he knew before would run anywhere and everywhere, completely oblivious to whose land he was on. Poliwag. The Poliwag nodded and began to explain its and the Sandshrew's situation. And what an explanation it was! It gave Will a trove of valuable information. The area around the small to medium-sized lake was divided into 3 major territories. One part was the domain of the Poliwag's father, a Poliwrath. This territory was mostly inhabited by weak Pokémon, which also made it the most peaceful area. This was because the Poliwrath would proactively drive out any Pokémon before it could grow strong enough to become a threat. Another part was the territory of the Sandshrew's father, a Sandslash. But the Sandslash lacked foresight. He was lazy and didn't manage his territory, allowing the Pokémon within it to grow unchecked. The price for this was that he was eventually defeated and eaten by a powerful Arbok. The Sandshrew had been on the run ever since. The Akans they just fought was the Arbok's offspring, which had followed the Sandshrew's scent all the way here. The final territory belonged to a Nidoking and Nidoqueen couple. Among the 3 local powers, this couple was the strongest. Their territory was also a sort of neutral ground. Anyone could live there, and anyone could attack other Pokémon. They didn't care what happened, as long as no one bothered the Nido family. So that's why you could run around everywhere without getting into trouble. You're the boss's spoiled kid. Will finally understood everything. At the same time, he felt a wave of relief, realizing he had been lucky enough to be born in the Poliwrath's territory. That explained why he hadn't encountered any truly powerful Pokémon on his journey. If he had been born in one of the other 2 zones, weak Pokémon like Caterpie and Weedle would have been nothing more than walking meals. I need to lay low here for a while longer. Once I'm stronger, I'll go out and claim more territory. For now, I'll set that Arbok as my target. Having sorted things out in his mind, Will turned and led Millie and Wally away. The Poliwag once again tried to get him to stay and play, but he refused. He still wasn't strong enough. He still didn't have time to play. Chapter 7, Grinding Levels. Over the next few days, Will brought Frost and Rusty back into the fold. The 2 former Weedle had both evolved into Beedrill, with heights of 1.5 m and 1.6 m, respectively. Their individual characteristics were also very distinct. Frost's yellow exoskeleton was a paler shade, which made his 2 large, white stingers and his wings seem to shine brightly. His hand and tail stingers were also massive, even larger than Wally's. Rusty's exoskeleton, on the other hand, was a coffee brown color. Judging by Millie's reactions, Rusty was considered quite the handsome one among Beedrill. During this time, Will focused primarily on one task, mapping the area. He didn't just scout the area around the lake, but also places further away. For example, on the other side of the Poliwrath's territory, it bordered 2 other domains, whose respective bosses were a Fearow and a Primeape. Both were known to be extremely hot-tempered Pokémon. Will took one look from a distance and left immediately, with no intention of testing their strength or their tempers. He also gave up any idea of expanding his territory in their direction. Primeape aside, Fearow were the natural enemies of Beedrill and incredibly difficult to deal with unless they had overwhelming numbers. Besides, Fearow had earned the great title of the poor man's Ho-Oh. In addition to scouting, Will specifically led his 4 Beedrill to find and gather berries with special effects. Tangleberries and Oran berries were 2 types they had to collect in large quantities. Among the many types of berries, these 2 were some of the few that could restore HP with no side effects, and the vast majority of Pokémon did not dislike their taste. Beyond those, cherry berries, chesto berries, pecha berries, and rost berries were also necessary to collect and store in small amounts. The purpose of all this, of course, was to grind levels. The vast majority of wild Pokémon only leveled up by constantly eating. They wouldn't go out of their way to pick fights just to get stronger. In fact, they didn't even have the concept of leveling up. Especially in this era of primal beasts, a battle between wild Pokémon often resulted in death or crippling injury, and there were no Pokémon centers to heal them. If they were seriously injured in a fight, their chances of survival would plummet. Therefore, as a rule, most Pokémon were unwilling to fight others of similar or greater strength. This was why the Akans had chosen to leave after seeing his group of 3 Beedrill. Even if it had won, the injuries it sustained would have likely made it impossible to hunt the Poliwag and Sandshrew. But Will, of course, had other ideas. Leveling up just by eating was far too slow. Without a doubt, battling other Pokémon was the fastest way to get stronger. But he needed a way to deal with post-battle injuries and lingering status effects. This was where these amazing berries came in. Alright, that should be enough. Let's go. We'll head over to that Arbok territory and make an appearance. We can't have the Pokémon in our future domain not recognizing us. Will looked at the massive piles of berries stacked on the nearby trees and nodded with satisfaction. For now, their territory only consisted of the dozen or so trees around their birthplace. With only 5 Beedrill, they didn't need a huge amount of land. Besides, the real boss of this area was the Poliwrath. Being too high profile might attract its attention and get them driven out. Frost, Rusty, you two stay behind and guard the base. Protect our berries. Will turned to his 2 weaker Beedrill. Frost and Rusty had evolved nearly a week later than the other 3, so their levels were naturally a bit lower. Will, Wally, and Millie had all reached LV13, while Frost and Rusty were only LV10. Still, that was more than enough to guard a dozen trees. As the Poliwag had said, there were no truly powerful Pokémon in this part of the forest. The more dangerous ones were Pokémon like Pidgeotto, Venonat, or Pikachu, and they were at most in the mid-teens level-wise. Pokémon above level 20 were practically non-existent, as they would all be driven out by the Poliwrath. Under these circumstances, he didn't have to worry about Frost and Rusty being unable to protect their stash. BZZX2. Frost and Rusty nodded. Now that they had evolved from Weedle to Beedrill, their intelligence had improved. They could now roughly understand Will's more complex sentences. Seeing this, Will turned with Wally and Millie and flew off in a specific direction. Although it would be more convenient to grind for levels nearby, fighting was forbidden within the Poliwrath's territory. Unless, you completely devoured your opponent after defeating them. As long as no other Pokémon found out, there would be no problem. Otherwise, the Poliwrath would chase them out. He and Millie hadn't known about this rule before, which is why Millie had eaten that Caterpie. But now that they were living under someone else's protection, it was best to follow the rules. Besides, Will actually approved of the Poliwrath's policy. As a fan of Pokémon, he still felt the world should be a more beautiful place. Constant killing and fighting was not the way. They flew on. With a Beedrill's flight speed, it took them less than 10 minutes to reach the neighboring territory. In truth, the Poliwrath's domain wasn't very large to begin with. Shortly after entering the new area, they spotted an excellent target. A Pinsir, 2.5 meters tall, was resting on a tree. Based on the rules of this forest, where most Pokémon were 1.5 to 2 times their normal size, this Pinsir was no exception. Pinsir. The high-speed vibration of the Beedrill's wings made a distinct buzzing sound, so the Pinsir noticed the 3 of them immediately. It flexed the massive horns on its head, attempting to intimidate them and scare them off. But Will had already set his sights on it. The Pinsir hesitated, then prepared to retreat and leave the tree to the 3 Beedrill. But Will hadn't come to claim territory, he had come for a fight. He certainly wasn't going to let the Pinsir go and initiated an attack at once. As for eating it, no sane creature would want to hunt a Pinsir. It was the kind of Pokémon a Fearow would rather starve to death than try to eat. Fury Cutter. This was the first time Will had used the move in a real battle. Before, he had only practiced his skills on the air or on trees. In simple terms, it involved swinging his 2 hand stingers with incredible speed. Seeing that he couldn't dodge, the Pinsir had no choice but to attack. A faint light gleamed on its pincers, and it lunged towards Will. Bug Bite. Will instantly recognized the move. After all, he had it too. Wally, Millie, let's go. Swarm him. This guy's level isn't low. At Will's call, the 3 Beedrill commenced a jumping group beatdown on the Pinsir. Chapter 8, First Encounter with Arbok. The Pinsir's level wasn't low. After all, the law of the jungle, the pure survival of the fittest, reigned in the Arbok's territory. If the Pinsir had been too weak, it never would have been able to claim a whole tree as its nest. But its level was also limited. Although Will couldn't see the exact level of other Pokémon, he could make a rough judgment by comparing their strength to his own. This Pinsir was probably only around level 15. In a one-on-one fight, Will wasn't even sure he would lose, given his superior intelligence and refusal to waste moves. Against a 3 drill group beatdown? It was no contest. The pincer lasted less than 3 minutes before the trio beat it until its eyes were swirling. Millie gave the unconscious pincer a second glance before looking away, feeling absolutely no appetite for it. As for Wally, it was even less of a consideration. Will had asked him before, and Wally had apparently never eaten another Pokémon. Now that they had achieved food freedom, their desire to prey on other Pokémon was practically zero. So, without any hesitation, Will led Wally and Millie deeper into the territory. Along the way, any Pokémon that entered their field of vision was subjected to a group beatdown. Butterfree, Pidgeotto, Rattata, Ekans, Nidorino, Venonat, Gloom, they fought nearly all of them. Their rampage finally came to a halt when they encountered a Paras that was definitely above level 20. After that battle, the stamina of all 3 Beedrill was completely drained, so they ended their expedition and returned home. Arriving back at their small territory of a dozen or so trees, Will felt a wave of relaxation wash over him. Frost and Rusty had already eaten their fill and were sound asleep. Eat. Then rest. Will gave the order and led the charge as he, Wally, and Millie began to eat. Tangleberries and Oran berries, which could restore HP, were their main focus. Millie was the first to finish. She landed on a random tree branch, lay down, and promptly fell asleep, displaying a complete lack of ladylike grace. Wally, being the largest, also had the biggest appetite and was still eating. Once Will felt he had eaten enough, he also lay down and opened his personal status screen. Beedrill. Potential, Blue. Level, 16. Type, Bug/Poison. Ability, Swarm. Height, 1.85 m. Weight, 60 kg. Moves, Fury Attack, Bug Bite, Poison Sting, String Shot, Harden, Fury Cutter, Focus Energy. Gain 3 levels. That's pretty fast, especially since the experience was split between me, Wally, and Millie. Will stared at his status screen, performing his daily analysis. He also noticed that his height and weight had increased again, making him marvel at the wondrous constitution of Pokémon. As for moves, he had gained focus energy, which allowed him to concentrate his mind so that his next attack would have an extremely high chance of landing a critical hit. More level grinding tomorrow. Will muttered to himself before closing his eyes and drifting off to sleep. A level of 16 was already considered upper middle class in the Polyrath's territory. Once he hit level 20, there was a high probability the Polyrath would start trying to chase him out. Will estimated that in 2 or 3 days, he would have to move his entire group to the neighboring Arbok's territory. The next morning, Will was awoken by a rustling sound. He opened his eyes to see Wally already eating nearby. He got up, stretched his limbs, and casually speared a few plump, juicy berries with his white stingers to munch on. A full breakfast was essential to have the energy for a day of fighting and grinding. The expeditionary team was once again the 3 Beedrill. Will took Wally and Millie out with him to level up. What they needed now was not balanced development across the team, but elite fighting power. Raising Frost's and Rusty's levels wasn't a priority. Once Will himself was powerful enough, everything else would be easier. They spent the next 2 days in the same fashion. On the 3rd day, Will had led Wally and Millie deep into the very center of the Arbok's territory. The levels of all 3 Beedrill had now reached 20. This level had already crossed the Polyrath's warning line, but it seemed the guardian of the safe zone hadn't noticed their situation yet, so it hadn't come to evict them. However, a level of 20 was by no means high here. You might not see Pokémon at this level in the Polyrath's territory because of its vigilance, but in the Arbok's lands, level 20-something Pokémon were everywhere. In the central region, there were even Pokémon over level 30. Right now, Will, Wally, and Millie were in this central region, looking for a fight. But before they could pick a satisfactory target, another Pokémon found them first. A Arbok. The sound came from the woods beside them. The next moment, a colossal creature descended from the branches of a giant tree above them, startling the 3 Beedrill so badly that they shot back several meters. When they got a clear look at the target, Will's expression turned grim. Millie even began to look agitated and uneasy. Wally, however, remained calm as ever, flying steadily behind Will. It was a massive Arbok, over 6 meters long. Arbok. The Arbok slithered down the tree trunk to the ground. Even with only the front half of its body raised, the snake stood nearly 3 meters tall. So this is the boss of this area. It's ridiculous. Feeling the powerful pressure radiating from the Arbok, Will could feel his own heart rate speeding up. He didn't even need to fight it to know the truth. Even if the three of them attacked together, they would be no match for this Arbok. Go! The moment he saw the Arbok, Will immediately turned and led Wally and Millie in a swift retreat. With their mobility, as long as they wanted to run, very few Pokémon could catch them. Even if the Arbok was a higher level with superior stats, they could just fly high into the air, where the ground-based snake couldn't do a thing to them. The Arbok clearly knew this as well, so it didn't even bother to give chase. Bzz. Aren't we going to fight it? Wally asked, a little confused. We can't beat it yet. We'll fight it in a few days, Will shook his head. A wise man knows when to pick his battles. There was no need to challenge the Arbok while they were still weak. The Pokémon of the era of primal beasts didn't know the meaning of mercy. Once you were defeated, you would be swallowed whole. As they were flying away, another faint hissing sound came from the side. SSSSSS. Will turned toward the sound and saw a decently sized Akans. It seemed to be the very same one they had seen in the Polyrath's territory a few days ago. You two stay out of this one. I'll handle it myself. Will scraped his two large, white stingers together and charged forward alone. The Akans's level couldn't be any higher than 22 at most. An Akans that reached that level would almost certainly evolve into an Arbok, and wild Pokémon instinctively craved evolution. They had no reason to refuse it and would evolve as soon as they could. Against an opponent of a similar level, Will had no intention of splitting the experience with Wally and Millie. Comment. 0 comment. Vote. Chapter 9, Moving Day. Chapter 9, Moving Day. After another hard day's work, it was already evening when Will returned home with Millie and Wally. They feasted on a large number of berries and fell into a deep sleep. He awoke sometime in the middle of the night. He felt a gaze fixed on him, pulling him uneasily from his dreams. He looked around, and his eyes finally settled on a large figure standing beneath the tree. A 3-meter-tall Polyrath. Seeing this creature, Will initially felt a bit puzzled. After all, a Poliwhirl needed a water stone to evolve into a Polyrath. A wild Pokémon wouldn't know if its evolution had special conditions, so it certainly wouldn't go out of its way to find an evolution stone. Seeing a Polyrath in the wild was an incredibly rare event. This one must have had some kind of fortunate encounter. This guy is even stronger than that Arbok. Will could tell just from the aura the Pokémon was emitting. The pressure he had felt from the Arbok during the day was mostly due to its intimidate ability at work. But the pressure from this Polyrath came from pure, unadulterated strength and a higher level. The Polyrath just stood there with its arms crossed, but it projected a presence that the newly crowned Arbok couldn't hope to match. It was clear this Polyrath had been the boss for a very long time. It had developed a natural, commanding aura. The Polyrath looked up, quietly watching Will in the tree. It didn't say a word before turning and walking away. He's telling us to leave. Although the Polyrath hadn't spoken, Will understood its meaning. It had probably heard from the little Poliwag that Will had saved him before, so its method of eviction was very gentle. It was practically inviting them to leave. We should probably leave once the sun comes up anyway. Living here is getting inconvenient, Will mumbled as he rolled over. These past few days, they had been fighting until they were half dead, only to have to fly a long way back to their nest. It was exhausting. It would be much better to just move directly into the Arbok's territory. They could claim a few trees as their territory there, and then slowly push outwards. Once they did, no blind fool of a Pokémon would dare to cause them trouble. Will estimated that at their current leveling speed, they should be strong enough to take on the Arbok in a group fight within a week. When that time came, their Beedrill swarm would be the new kings of that patch of land. With that thought, he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. When he woke again the next morning, Will called over the other 4 Beedrill. It's time for us to move. Bzz? Why? Frost tilted his head in confusion. He thought their current home was perfect. They had endless food and a very peaceful environment. Why would they need to leave? Well, we're going to take over other Pokémon's territory, live in a more comfortable nest, and eat even tastier berries, Will said after a moment of thought. You couldn't explain complex ideas to young Pokémon like these. They wouldn't understand idioms about being prepared for danger in times of peace. There was no such thing as a permanently safe environment. The Sandshrew from the other day was a prime example. Besides, even if they didn't actively grind for levels, they would eventually hit level 20 just by eating every day, and the Polyrath would evict them then anyway. Bzz. Okay. Let's move. Frost's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. Just grab those berries. We can always gather the other stuff later, Will said, pointing to the rarer berries that cured status effects. As for common berries like tangleberries and oran berries, which were everywhere, there was no need to transport them. Each of the 5 Beedrill picked up a small pile of berries and flew towards the Arbok's territory. Moving day for Pokémon was just that easy. There wasn't much to pack. Their only real possession was this stash of berries, and even that wasn't particularly important. If Will hadn't been too lazy to spend time searching for these rare berries again, he would have just taken his squad over with nothing at all. Bzzz. Will was already very familiar with this flight path. Likewise, the Pokémon living along this path had become very familiar with Will and his Beedrill. Now, they didn't even have to look up. The moment they heard the distinct buzz of their wings, they knew it was time to hide. Otherwise, that psycho would lead his gang over to give them a beating. Will flew at the front, his wings beating so fast they nearly gave Wally and Millie a cold. He was being deliberately high profile to let everyone in the Arbok's territory know they had arrived. After days of beating up everyone along this route, many Pokémon had memorized the sound of his squad. Now, hearing it again only made them want to run as far away as possible. Let's set up camp here for now. Will finally settled on a territory that belonged to a Weepinbell. He had noticed that the fruit trees in this area had an excellent harvest, the fruit on the branches was almost untouched. It was clear that the Weepinbell not only didn't eat the berries but had actually taken great care of the trees. As for what the Weepinbell ate, it certainly wasn't dirt. Don't be fooled by its plant-like appearance. A Weepinbell might look harmless, but the reality was completely different. When a Weepinbell got hungry, it would swallow anything that moved. Small Pokémon like Rattata and Caterpie would be swallowed whole, where the dissolving fluid in its mouth would melt them down into food. Under the collective gaze of 5 Beedrill, the Weepinbell fled reluctantly. Will had already beaten it once by himself. Now that its opponent had brought 4 friends, it had no desire to get beaten again. Alright, from today onwards, this area is our territory. Will chose the largest tree in the vicinity as their main nest. They spent the rest of the day organizing their new home and greeting the neighbors. They gathered soft leaves to make beds at the top of the tree trunk. Then they harvested all the fully ripe berries and stored them under a cool pile of leaves. After that, they carved cross marks into the large trees within their territory as a warning to other Pokémon. The final step was greeting the neighbors. Many of them were old faces that Will had already beaten up, and the few who weren't quickly got acquainted after receiving their own beatdown. Now, basically every Pokémon in the surrounding area knew that a small Beedrill swarm had moved into the Arbok's territory. But in reality, how could 5 Beedrill even be considered a swarm? Frost, Rusty, I have a mission for you too. From now on, if you see any of our weaker kin, bring them back to our territory. We need to expand our team. Will ordered the 2 Beedrill, who had been lazing around the base all day. From here on out, he would tackle leveling and expansion simultaneously. He would take Wally and Millie to continue battling everywhere, accumulating experience and raising their levels as fast as possible. Meanwhile, Frost and Rusty would be responsible for finding weak Weedle and Kakuna. They would protect these weaker brethren as they grew, thereby expanding the size of their team. Chapter 10, A Human Child? For the next several days, Will frequently went out with Wally and Millie to battle. But unlike before, he now fought his battles solo while Wally and Millie stood guard nearby, preventing any situations where a predator might try to ambush the victor. Although this method was more time-consuming, tiring, and dangerous, the results were extremely noticeable. Beedrill. Potential, Blue. Level, 27. Type, Bug/Poison. Ability, Swarm. Height, 2m. Weight, 70 kilograms. Moves, Fury Attack, Bug Bite, Poison Sting, String Shot, Harden, Fury Cutter, Focus Energy, Venoshock, Assurance. A week passed. Will had now pulled far ahead of the other Beedrill. While Wally and Millie were still only around level 22, he had already reached level 27 on his own. In the Arbok's current territory, this level of strength placed him at the very top of the food chain. The only ones who might be stronger were the 2 or 3 Pokémon at the very center of the territory, whose levels were all upwards of 30. In addition, the size of their 5-member squad had increased dramatically. It could now truly be called a small swarm. The number of Beedrill was still just the 5 of them. But they now had 6 Kakuna and 13 Weedle under their protection. It wasn't that Will didn't want to recruit other Beedrill. It was that nearly every Beedrill they encountered already belonged to a swarm from deeper within the forest. After thinking about it, he figured out the reason. Weedle were at the bottom of the food chain, perhaps only a tiny bit stronger than Caterpie. Kakuna had almost no ability to defend themselves, existing only to wait for evolution or be eaten. It was incredibly difficult for these two forms to grow up in this primal forest. Only the Weedle and Kakuna within a larger Beedrill swarm could grow up safely under the protection of their evolved kin. Some smaller Beedrill swarms would even consciously seek out lone Weedle and Kakuna to bring them into their fold, just like what Will's group was doing now. When those Weedle and Kakuna evolved, they naturally became members of the swarm that had protected them. That was why Will had never found any unaffiliated Beedrill. However, he did manage to gather some other useful information from these Beedrill who came from the deeper parts of the forest. For example, the area where Will currently resided was the outermost ring of the entire forest. All the major Beedrill swarms lived in the middle ring. But because lone Weedle and Kakuna had trouble surviving deeper in, often getting eaten before they could evolve, the smaller swarms from the middle ring had to come to the outer edge to recruit new members. At present, Will's Beedrill swarm was the only one in the entire outer ring. Why wouldn't they stay in the outer ring? Why go deeper inside? Will couldn't help but wonder. The deeper you went into the forest, the more dangerous it became. For a Beedrill swarm, developing in the outer ring should have been much easier. It was a question to which Will had no answer for now. In any case, he had no intention of proactively leading his team deeper into the forest. Keep raising my level. That was Will's only goal right now. He would continue to get stronger, defeat the Arbok, and turn this territory into the domain of their growing Beedrill swarm. After a hearty meal at the nest, Will flew to the river to quench his thirst. As he lowered his head to drink, a floating figure on the water's surface caught his attention. He looked up. A human. Will stared at the figure on the water, his mind reeling in shock. It was clearly a small human girl, though it was impossible to tell if she was alive or dead. After a moment's hesitation, Will decided to go take a look. He flapped his wings and flew over quickly. Hooking his 2 large stingers under the cloth of her clothes, he easily lifted the small girl into the air. He then immediately flew back towards his territory with her in his arms. The lake wasn't particularly large, but there were definitely Pokémon living in it. It was likely the territory of some water type, and he didn't want to linger near it for too long. Back in his territory, Wally, Millie, and the other Beedrill saw their boss return carrying a creature and flew over to see what was going on. Millie probably thought Will had brought her back some tasty prey. None of you are to harm her, Will commanded the surrounding Beedrill and the Weedle that were gradually gathering around. Hearing his words, Millie and some of the Weedle left in disappointment. They had thought it was something good to eat. Frost and Rusty, however, looked on curiously at the new creature. They had never seen a Pokémon with such a strange form before. She's still alive. Will looked down at the girl's chest and, noticing its gentle rise and fall, nodded in confirmation. It had been almost a month since he was reborn as a Pokémon, and this was the first time he had seen a human. Seeing a human in the era of primal beasts was no easy feat. Human civilization during this time was broadly divided into 2 periods, tribes and kingdoms. In the earlier period, humans were still competing with the primal beasts for resources. But being fewer in number and physically weaker, humans were no match for Pokémon and could only survive by gathering in areas with fewer Pokémon, like plains and mountains. It was only later, when the human population grew and the concept of kingdoms emerged, that they learned to use the power of Pokémon to fight other Pokémon, turning the tide. But regardless of the period, humans were terrified of Pokémon. No ordinary person would ever willingly venture into a place like a forest, where Pokémon thrived. That's what made seeing this girl so unusual. Will couldn't help but wonder why on earth she had come into this forest. For the rest of the day, to prevent any accidents, Will stayed by the little girl's side. He sent Wally and the other 3 Beedrill out to go beat up other Pokémon and gain experience. By now, the Pokémon living around Will's territory had either fled long ago or were clever enough to realize this group of Beedrill had no intention of eating them. So, these clever ones not only didn't run away, but they actually moved a little closer to Will's territory. They'd get beaten up, sure, but at least they wouldn't die. And if a real threat appeared, they could temporarily hide inside Will's domain, reducing their chances of being eaten by other, stronger Pokémon. Time passed quickly. Will only remembered falling asleep twice before the little girl began to show signs of waking up. Then, one night, the girl, who had been mumbling and muttering in her sleep, suddenly regained consciousness. But when she opened her eyes and saw the 2-meter-tall Beedrill standing beside her, she immediately screamed, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she fainted again. Will scratched his head, found 2 oran berries, and squeezed their juice into the little girl's mouth. Feeling the sweet, moisture-rising liquid, the little girl's eyelids fluttered. It was obvious she was awake again but was now too afraid to open her eyes. Chapter 11, The Swarm's Newcomer. Let's see how long you can keep this up. Will waited quietly, watching the little girl play dead on the ground. In truth, he was feeling a little happy. It had been a long time since he'd had this kind of amusing distraction. For the past month, his life had been a monotonous cycle of eating, sleeping, and fighting. The constant pressure of survival forced him to get stronger every single moment. This was especially true now that he was the leader of a Beedrill swarm. He was constantly thinking about how to guide the entire group's development to ensure his own future safety. The little girl lying on the ground twitched her lips in frustration. She could clearly feel the creature's eyes on her, but nothing was happening, which made her feel incredibly awkward. After a 2-second hesitation, she cautiously cracked open her eyes and turned her head to look at Will. Will thought for a moment, then speared a tangleberry with one of his stingers and offered it to the girl. Seeing Will move, the girl first shrank back in fear. "Thank you." But when she realized he wasn't trying to hurt her, but was instead giving her a piece of fruit, she was shocked and subconsciously whispered her thanks. Will's actions dealt a massive blow to the girl's understanding of the world. In all the knowledge she had ever learned, and in all her life experiences, she had never once heard of or seen a primal beast show such kindness to a human. The little girl took the berry and began to eat it in big bites, her eyes scanning her surroundings. Her expression turned to one of terror, but then her gaze shifted back to Will, and she nodded with renewed determination. "Hello. My name is Liz." Liz stood up and, mustering her courage, walked right up to Will. "Bzz." Will didn't know what to say, so he just made a random sound. It didn't matter what he said anyway, the little girl wouldn't understand him. "Are you greeting me? You're so friendly." "Ha ha ha, from now on, we're friends." Liz reached out with both hands, grabbed one of Will's, and shook it up and down. To be honest, as she gripped the thick, hard, white stinger, Liz's heart was pounding in her chest. She was terrified that the beast in front of her might suddenly stab her to death. But the situation was critical. This forest was filled with countless dangerous beasts. A normal little girl like her would surely die if she wandered around alone. Her only chance of survival was this creature in front of her, who seemed reasonably friendly. This beast was so big and looked so strong, surely it could protect her. Bzz. Will suddenly found this quite interesting. He buzzed again, curious to see what the little girl would say next. "I come from the Dragonite tribe outside the forest. I'm the princess of the Dragonite tribe. My full name is Liz of the Dragonite tribe." Liz had no idea what the beast's buzzing meant, but she was terrified of the silence, so she quickly began to chatter away at Will. Will just listened quietly, and the more he listened, the more he understood about the era he was in. Not only was he in the era of primal beasts, but he was in its first half, the tribal period. And Liz was most likely an ancestor of the Dragonite clan from the Johto region. That would make her an ancestor of Lance, the future champion of both Kanto and Johto. As for the forest he was in, or more accurately, the mountain, it was called Mt. Silver. It was the dividing point between the Kanto and Johto regions. On the other side of the forest lay Kanto. Liz's tribe had entered the mines of Mt. Silver and clashed with the Sylph tribe from the other side. The two tribes had entered a state of war over the mineral resources. The name Sylph was also familiar to Will. It was the precursor to the economic powerhouse of the Kanto region in the era of leagues, a leader in Pokémon world manufacturing. They had created the foundational technology for Pokeballs and continuously innovated upon it. TMS, potions, escape ropes, repels, and various other held items were all developed by the Sylph Co. But because they controlled so much key technology, Sylph Co was later targeted and controlled by Team Rocket. Incredible, truly incredible. Will shook his head as he listened. If his hands hadn't become two giant white stingers, he probably would have started clapping. Who would have thought that two famous powers, who would have nothing to do with each other in the future, were currently trying to beat each other's brains out in the ancient past. Gradually, Liz began to feel cold. It wasn't quite the peak of summer, and the nights in the forest were chilly. For Liz to have only just noticed the cold after being awake for so long showed how dazed she was. The clothes humans wore in this era were not very warm. One look at the simple cloth tunic on the Dragonite princess made that clear. As she spoke, Liz's body began to tremble slightly. Seeing this, Will poked an aspear berry from the nearby fruit pile and offered it to her. The aspear berry, when eaten, could make the body feel warm and was generally used to cure the frozen status condition. It was also a key fruit many Pokémon relied on to survive the winter. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry." Liz subconsciously took the berry and took a bite, then shook her head. By now, she was no longer as panicked or afraid. She could tell that Will meant her no harm, or at least didn't plan on eating her. But soon, a warm current spread through her stomach, and she felt her body gradually warming up. She looked at the aspear berry in her hand, her eyes lit up, and she quickly took several more bites. "Whoa, this is amazing! If we had this, the warriors fighting outside wouldn't freeze to death." Liz memorized what the aspear berry looked like. If she could get back to the Dragonite tribe, she had to tell everyone about this fruit. Then, even if they couldn't start a fire in the wild, no one would have to suffer from the cold. Will glanced at the kid, ate a few berries himself, and then lay down to sleep. "Hey, can you please not sleep? I want to drink some water. Can you understand what I'm saying?" Liz crept over to Will's side and gently poked his body with a finger. Will lifted his head, feeling exasperated, and pointed a stinger at the fruit pile. The meaning was clear: she could eat the fruit to quench her thirst. He had no intention of leaving the tree at night. Many Pokémon hunted in the dark, and for him, who was used to fighting in the daytime, the night was not a good time to be out. "I'm not hungry." "Oh, never mind." Liz blinked her eyes and pitifully ran over to grab 2 berries to suck the juice out of. As she ate, she glanced over and saw that Will was already lying down, ready to sleep. She looked around nervously. From the dark forest, she could hear the strange and melodious cries of some unknown Pokémon. The sounds sent a shiver down Liz's spine. She trembled, quickly finished her 2 berries, and then ran over to Will's side, snuggling up close against him as she lay down. Will glanced at the kid, then closed his eyes and ignored her. The next morning, all the Beedrill, Kakuna, and Weedle of the swarm came to know that there was a newcomer in their midst. A strange, small, and incredibly weak Pokémon. Chapter 12, Battling Heracross. Early in the morning. "Goldie, you have to come back early today, okay?" Liz stood under the tree, waving at Will as he departed. Will didn't even want to turn his head. He just kept moving forward with Millie and Wally. Goldie was the name Liz had given him based on his color, and it left him speechless. It was an even more dog-like name than the one he had given Wally. Rattata. Rattata. Just as Will was planning to take his crew to try and challenge the Arbok today, 3 Pokémon suddenly ran out from the nearby forest. It was a giant Raticate and his 2 little Rattata wives. This couldn't help but make Will wonder if he hadn't been high-profile enough lately. Even a garbage little gang like this dared to come and cause trouble. "If you want to challenge my position, you should at least bring an army of 100,000 Rattata, don't you think?" Will had no memory of this particular Raticate. His sense of aesthetics was still human, which made him effectively face-blind in the Pokémon world. He couldn't even remember if he had beaten this Raticate before. "Raticate. Boss, a misunderstanding." "Hey." Will hovered in the air, looking down at the creature. "Bzz, Will, this one has always lived near our territory." Wally, on the other hand, remembered the Raticate quite clearly. "Oh." Hearing Wally's explanation, Will immediately understood. This Raticate was one of the local squatters. It had been beaten by them several times but refused to move. Instead, it was one of the clever ones who had started to thrive under the protection of the Beedrill swarm. And look at it now, the once lonely Raticate had now found itself 2 little wives. "What are you here for then? Looking for a beating?" Will asked, a strange expression on his face. Surely this guy didn't have some kind of masochistic streak, actively seeking out a beatdown just to give him experience points, right? "Rattata. A big guy is heading this way," the Raticate boss squeaked anxiously, pointing in a specific direction. "What?" Will looked in that direction. A dopey-looking Heracross was walking towards them. This Heracross was a full 3.5 meters tall. The Pokédex stated that an average Heracross was only 1.5 m tall, even doubling that would only be 3 m. This wasn't a matter of high level, but purely a case of being gifted with a massive physique. He had seen this Heracross before. It was originally one of the most powerful Pokémon living in the center of this region. But since it couldn't defeat the Arbok, it proved its level wasn't exceptionally high. It was just a constitution that was prone to growing large. Such individuals existed in the human race, so of course they existed among Heracross too. A Heracross uses the horn on its head to sense smells, gathering in forests to search for sweet tree sap. The fact that it was heading this way meant it had smelled something sweet nearby. Oh well. Guess we're not fighting the Arbok today. Let's have a go with this guy instead. Will couldn't help but smile. He was now the local bully of this forest, beating up other Pokémon everywhere to grind for levels. The smart ones, like this Raticate, realized Will fought but didn't kill, so they stayed nearby and benefited from his swarm's protection. The not-so-smart ones would just run away sad and dejected after getting beaten, off to face the dangers of the forest elsewhere. Hera. The Heracross looked at Will, who had suddenly blocked its path, and tilted its head in confusion. It didn't seem to want to fight. It shifted its feet to the side, apparently intending to walk around him. But Will had no intention of letting it go so easily. You two stay out of it. I'll handle this myself. Will waved a stinger, signaling for Wally and Millie, who were about to charge, to back off. He was going to take on this Heracross, which was definitely above LV 30, one-on-one. With a massive type advantage, Will felt this was a winnable fight. He was bug/poison. Heracross was bug/fighting. Against him, a Heracross's bug-type moves would only do half damage, and its fighting-type moves would only do a quarter. In contrast, while Will's bug-type moves would also be halved, his poison-type moves would deal full damage. Focus energy. Harden. While the Heracross was still looking confused, Will began to layer himself with buffs. Wild Pokémon rarely had the concept of buffing themselves in battle, only a trainer would give such a command. And Will was his own trainer. A beast versus a beast, are they going to fight? Liz, standing under a nearby tree, realized what was happening, her eyes shining with excitement. Tui. String shot. Will shot wads of silk from his mouth, aiming for the Heracross's feet and sticking them to the ground. Hera. The dopey Heracross still hadn't registered what was going on. Poison sting. Pew. Pew. When the stingers started hitting its body and it felt the pain, the Heracross finally understood that this Beedrill wanted to fight. Its expression changed, and it charged forward, intending to deliver a heavy blow with the horn on its head. But because its feet were tangled in Will's silk, its movements were not fast. Will flapped his wings and easily flew into the air to dodge. Hera. The Heracross stomped a foot in anger. The shell on its back opened, and two wings emerged. It also took flight, charging towards Will again. That giant bug can fly. Liz, the spectator, couldn't help but cover her mouth in shock. It was the first time she had ever seen such a huge insectoid Pokémon, so she was completely stunned. She couldn't even imagine the kind of damage a creature like that could do to her tribe's farmland. Assurance. Will's figure flashed. He took advantage of the moment Heracross had just taken flight, before it could build up speed, and thrust both of his stingers into its chest. Although it was a dark-type move, whose damage was reduced against a fighting type, the move's unique effect boosted its power, so the final damage was nothing to scoff at. Crack. Hera. The dual stingers stabbed into the shell of the Heracross's abdomen, hitting a vital point and dealing massive damage. The abdomen was a Heracross's weakest point, while its head was the hardest. Attacking its stomach was the easiest way to land a critical hit. But then, something unexpected happened. Even after taking a critical hit, the Heracross endured the pain, reached out, and grabbed both of Will's stingers. Its grip was so strong that Will couldn't break free. Venoshock. With no other choice, Will sprayed a blast of poison right in the Heracross's face, dealing another huge blow of damage. But the Heracross's counterattack was immediate. It grabbed Will and began to spin, plummeting towards the ground. Seismic toss. One of this guy's parents must have been a Volbeat. Crash. The thought had barely formed in Will's mind when he felt a massive impact on his head. The pain was so intense he almost coughed up blood. The Heracross quickly got to its feet, raised one arm high, and brought it chopping down on the fallen Will. A fighting-type brick break. Fury attack. With no time to dodge, Will countered, rapidly thrusting with his 2 hand stingers and the stinger on his tail. Smack! The brick break hit Will squarely on the head. His mind went blank, everything started spinning, and then his eyes rolled back as he fainted. But the Heracross, struck by Will's fury attack, was also defeated. Its eyes turned to swirls, and it collapsed, knocked out. Chapter 13, Cared for by Liz. Ugh! His consciousness hazy and dim, Will shifted his body uncomfortably. Goldie, you have to get better soon. Liz's voice sounded by his ear. Then, Will felt the child place something in his mouth. He chewed instinctively. Based on the primarily sweet and sour taste, he could tell it was an oran berry. An oran berry looked like a purple orange and had the same effect as a tangleberry, restoring 10 HP when eaten. It was an extremely common berry in the wild, often used by Pokémon to fill their stomachs. Warm, why am I so warm? Will gradually opened his eyes. He found himself being held in Liz's arms as she fed him the berry. Goldie! You're awake! Liz smiled happily when she saw Will open his eyes. She had been incredibly worried during the 2 or 3 hours he had been unconscious. It wasn't that their bond was particularly strong, they had known each other for less than a day, after all. She was just terrified that if Will, the leader, died and there was no one in charge, his beastly underlings would eat her. Pain. Will tried to move but found his entire body ached, leaving him almost immobile. Although he was conscious, his condition had not yet recovered. He hadn't expected that Heracross to be so strong, especially with an inherited move like Seismic Toss. That move, combined with its ridiculous height and weight, resulted in explosive damage. But the results were also clear. Defeating a Heracross so many levels higher than him had provided Will with a huge amount of experience, causing him to level up twice, from LV27 to LV29. He had also learned a new move, Toxic Spikes. Judging solely by its effect in the games, a move like Toxic Spikes might seem useless in the wild, but its actual application was surely more than that. In the future, he could scatter Toxic Spikes around his territory. Any Pokémon that trespassed, as long as it wasn't a poison or steel type, would become poisoned. Goldie, you just stay here and don't move, okay? I'm going to find some herbs for you. Seeing how pale Will looked, Liz stood up and ran off. For a child living in this era of primal beasts, identifying wild medicinal herbs was a mandatory life skill, even for the princess of a tribe. Will watched the little girl run off by herself and quickly ordered Wally and Millie, protect her. He truly had no idea where this kid got the audacity to run around alone. Even he wouldn't dare to wander off by himself. One wrong move could get you killed. There was a reason Pokémon from this era were called primal beasts. These untamed wild Pokémon didn't know the meaning of mercy. To fight for resources, they would eliminate any and all enemies, just like humans. Although Wally and Millie were only LV22, which was merely mid-tier in this region, very few Pokémon would dare to provoke the two of them when they were together. So, less than half an hour later, Liz returned with a few handfuls of grass. What is this stuff? Will looked at the ordinary-looking sprigs, seeing no difference between them and the weeds that grew everywhere. Now Goldie, don't move. This might hurt a little, so you have to bear with it, okay? Liz popped the grass into her mouth and started chewing. After just a few chews, her face scrunched up. The grass was clearly very bitter. Then, she spat the mushy herbal paste onto her hand and started smearing it on Will's injuries. What are you doing? That's disgusting. Get your hands off me. Will's eyes went wide as he watched Liz's hand get closer and closer. There, it won't hurt, it won't hurt. Liz thought Will was just afraid of the pain, so she quickly used her other hand to stroke his head, trying to comfort him. The herbal paste was smeared onto Will's body. The next moment, he felt an immense jolt of pain and his whole body trembled violently. Wally and Millie, thinking Will was under attack, instantly prepared to stab Liz to death. Stop, Will yelled hastily, then gave Liz an exasperated look. Did this little girl not realize how dangerous her actions were? It was only because he could understand her words that she was safe. If he were any other Pokémon who couldn't understand, or who was in too much pain to listen, that sharp jolt of agony would have been more than enough reason for them to launch a fatal attack. By the time the Pokémon realized its mistake, Liz would have already been dead. How is it, Goldie? Feeling much better, right? Liz's eyes lit up, completely oblivious to the danger that had just passed. She was just purely happy that Will's condition seemed to have improved. Thinking of this, she quickly brought over some more berries to feed him. Will glanced at Liz, then opened his mouth and obediently accepted the food. Humans really did have a higher skill level in caring. After that, Will quietly accepted Liz's care. Before he knew it, 3 days had passed. It was incredibly difficult for a wild Pokémon to recover from its own injuries. No wonder most of them were unwilling to fight opponents of equal strength. Once injured, it could take days to heal, and during that time, if you were unlucky, you would go hungry. It could even increase the probability of being preyed upon by other Pokémon. Goldie. One morning, Will was awoken by Liz's voice. He sat up and looked at her. The once clean and cute little girl was now filthy. Not only was her face covered in dirt, but she also had an indescribable smell about her. What is it? My tummy hurts, and I want to take a bath. My body feels sticky and uncomfortable. Liz clutched her stomach with a pitiful expression, looking utterly miserable. Will paused for a moment. It was only then that he remembered, Liz was a human. She was fundamentally different from Pokémon like them. If she kept eating nothing but berries and didn't bathe, her body was bound to have problems sooner or later. I have to send this kid back. Will thought to himself with a frown. But for now, he decided he should first take Liz to get cleaned up. And so, Will picked up Liz and flew with her towards the lake. Whoa, I'm flying! Looking down from mid-air, Liz couldn't help but dance with joy. She wasn't worried at all that her movements might affect Will's flight and cause them both to fall. Will didn't know whether to call Liz brave or just purely trusting of him. If it was the latter, then Liz had what could only be described as the heart of a natural-born trainer. This kind of blind trust would be foolish in human society, but when dealing with Pokémon, it was a powerful weapon, a weapon that could dramatically increase a Pokémon's affection. Chapter 14, Eyes in the Shadows. At the small lake, Liz scrubbed herself clean in the water. The water was cool, making the little girl shiver. Hurry up and get out when you're done washing, Will yawned, lying bored on the shore. When he bathed, he just rolled around in the water for a moment and was done. He never smelled bad if he didn't bathe, nor did he feel uncomfortable. As for the other Pokémon like Wally, Will had never seen them bathe at all. Goldie, don't rush me. Liz didn't know why she could understand Will's meaning. She remembered that at first, she couldn't understand his words at all. While she still didn't understand them perfectly, she could now vaguely sense the urging tone in his voice. Her experiences over the past few days had caused an idea to begin forming in Liz's mind. Could humans and Pokémon become friends? And could they then borrow the power of Pokémon to fight their enemies? Judging by her relationship with Goldie, Liz thought it was possible. A few more minutes passed, and Liz finally climbed out of the lake. Will handed her an aspir berry. She took it and immediately took a bite, her body quickly warming up. Thanks, Goldie, Liz said with a grin. The thoughts in her head were becoming more and more elaborate. Given her relationship with Goldie, could she ask him and his beastly kin to help the Dragonite tribe fight the Sylph tribe? In return, her tribe could provide them with endless food and a safe, comfortable environment. It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. However, Liz wasn't the only one thinking this way. At that moment, in the forest on the other side of the lake, a tall man with coffee-colored skin, holding a long spear, was lying prone in the bushes, secretly watching Liz and Will from a distance. Although he was too far away to see clearly, he could still recognize the little girl as the princess of the rival Dragonite tribe. The princess of the Dragonite tribe is getting along so well with a primal beast. Could it be that the Dragonite tribe has already mastered a way to command them? The man muttered, cold sweat dripping from his forehead. If his guess was true, then the Sylph tribe would undoubtedly face a catastrophe. Those were primal beasts. Creatures that took 3 to 5 grown men from his tribe just to take one down. And that one could fly. It didn't look small, either, it was clearly not an easy beast to deal with. I must report this to the elders at once and let them decide what to do. The man didn't watch any longer. He turned and ran. He had to return to the tribe immediately and report what he had seen. After her bath, Liz looked much cleaner, almost like her old self, though her hair was still a mess. But because she had been eating nothing but cold berries for days, the little girl's physical condition was clearly not good. She was already showing signs of a cold and an upset stomach. Where is your home? Will had already decided to send Liz out of the forest. Although it was nostalgic to see a human again, he was now a Pokémon, a primal beast living in a savage era. He was no longer suited to live alongside humans. What are you saying, Goldie? I can't understand you. Liz scratched her head. She could feel that Will was asking her something, but she didn't understand the specific meaning. Will scratched his head, picked up the now dressed Liz, and carried her into the air. He flew high, scanned the surroundings, and then, after picking a direction, flew forward. The terrain of the Kanto and Johto regions was characterized by many plains. Therefore, whichever direction the wind blew strongest from was most likely the direction of the forest's edge. Goldie Achoo! Where are you taking me? Liz sneezed from the cool wind as she was carried through the air. Will didn't speak and just kept flying in his chosen direction. After flying for a while, he noticed that the terrain ahead remained flat, showing no signs of getting higher. He knew he had chosen the right direction. Because he was on MT Silver, if he had flown the wrong way, the terrain should have gotten progressively higher. After another 5 minutes of flying, Will could already see the outside of the forest. Beyond the trees was indeed a relatively flat grassland, which looked very suitable for farming and grazing. It was far more suited for human survival than the forest. Liz saw it too. Hey? We're out of the forest. Goldie, are you taking me home? Liz finally understood Will's intention. Will answered her guess with his actions. He flew out of the forest, placed Liz on the grass, and then waved a stinger, gesturing for her to leave on her own. No way. Goldie, don't leave me. Seeing this, Liz immediately threw her arms around him. With a powerful leap, she clung to Will's body like an octopus. Will's face contorted into a vivid expression of confusion. I've brought you this far, what more do you want? I don't know the way. I have no memory of this place at all. If you leave me here, I won't be able to get back. You don't even know the way to your own home. Will was speechless. He hadn't expected that Liz, who looked to be 8 or 9 years old, wouldn't know her way home. He could only assume that, as a pampered princess, she had probably never traveled far from home. Let's just go back. My father told me that if I ever get lost, I should stay put and wait for him to find me. If I stay with you, everyone from the tribe will definitely send people to come get me. Liz hugged Will tightly and refused to let go. The grasslands were safer than the forest, but they weren't without danger. A little girl like her could easily be snatched away by some large passing beast. For Liz, the safest place to be right now was by Will's side. A few minor health problems were nothing, it was definitely better than being dead. And if she could become the link that united Will and the Dragonite tribe, then all these current hardships were just small issues. Will hadn't imagined that Liz was thinking so far ahead. In his eyes, she was just an ordinary 8-year-old girl who didn't know anything yet. But he had forgotten something. The children of the Pokémon world matured early, especially in this brutal era where if you didn't mature fast, you died young. After thinking it over, he realized Liz had a point. If she didn't know the way, it was better for her to stay in their nest for now. And so, Will once again picked up Liz and flew back. Goldie, what are you guys going to do next? What do you usually do? Liz asked curiously from Will's back. It was her first time being integrated into the life of primal beasts, and she found observing their habits fascinating. Next. Will grinned and looked off in a certain direction. This territory is about to change hands. Chapter 15, Alpha Beedrill. Liz returned to the Beedrill swarm as if she were coming back to her own home. Over the past few days, her tree climbing skills had become even more polished. She nimbly scrambled up a tree and, with practiced ease, plucked an oran berry, her favorite, and popped it into her mouth. Will paid the girl no mind. He called for Wally and Millie, and the three of them headed out. As a LV-29 Beedrill, accompanied by 2 LV-23 Beedrill followers, taking down the Arbok was an absolute certainty. Today, this territory would change hands. Goldie, whatever you're going to do, good luck. As Will departed with his 2 followers, Liz stood on a branch and waved at him. Will didn't turn back, just gave a casual wave of his stinger. A quarter of an hour later, Will, Wally, and Millie arrived in the Arbok's territory. The Arbok, still unaware of what was about to happen, stood on the ground and glared at the 3 Beedrill. It probably thought they were the same weaklings from a few days ago. If it were a few days ago, the 3 Beedrill combined would indeed have been no match for it and would have ended up as a meal. But times had changed. The Arbok had no idea what it was about to face. Get him! At Will's command, the 3 Beedrill charged forward as one. Wally and Millie played a supporting role, constantly using string shot and poison sting to hinder the Arbok's movements. Will hung back, stacking buffs on himself and looking for the perfect opportunity to launch a surprise attack and land a critical blow. The battle lasted a long time. Because Will refused to engage the Arbok head-on, the snake eventually realized something was wrong and tried to flee, but the three Beedrill chased it relentlessly. They fought on the run. The battlefield shifted from the Arbok's territory into the Polyrath's, which even attracted the attention of the Polyrath itself. Initially, the Polyrath was about to intervene when it saw the Arbok trespass. But when it saw Will and his crew, it understood this was a battle for dominance. Given that Will had previously helped his son, the Polyrath chose to turn a blind eye to the fact that the war had spilled over into his land. Half an hour later, the Arbok collapsed in defeat. Hey? Why did my stats change so much? Will had thought that defeating the Arbok would, at most, raise him by 1 level. He never expected the change to be so dramatic. Beedrill, Alpha. Potential, Blue. Level, 30. Type, Bug/Poison. Ability, Swarm. Height, 3m. Weight, 120 kilograms. Moves, Fury Attack, Bug Bite, Poison Sting, String Shot, Harden, Fury Cutter, Focus Energy, Venoshock, Assurance, Toxic Spikes. Not only did a conspicuous, Alpha, tag appear on his status screen, but more importantly, his height and weight had skyrocketed. The change was so obvious that Wally and Millie couldn't help but stare at him in a daze, seemingly unable to process what had just happened. Isn't this a feature from that Arceus game? Will, however, remembered something. He recalled that in the game Pokémon Legends, Arceus, special boss Pokémon marked as Alpha would appear in the wild. These Pokémon were typically far larger than others of their species. Will, so big. Will, so strong. Wally and Millie couldn't help but exclaim in amazement, their eyes filled with even more adoration. It was as if a leader's radiance had suddenly appeared around Will, and under its glow, their reverence for him was amplified. Let's head back first, Will said, frowning as he looked down at his own body. He decided it was best to return to their territory first. Do other Pokémon also have special Alpha individuals? Why haven't I seen any before? Is it because I've truly become the master of a territory? On the way back, Will mulled over the situation. The Alpha designation was clearly important. It had massively increased his height and weight, which was a huge, indirect boost to his survivability. If possible, he wanted to keep this status stable. Back at their territory. Goldie. How did you suddenly get so big? Liz scrambled down from her tree and stood before Will, her eyes wide with astonishment. Could a primal beast really grow so much in such a short time? If so, then humanity stood no chance of ever fighting them. Will didn't answer Liz because he wasn't entirely sure what had happened himself. Thinking about it now, he realized that the Arbok, the Polyrath, and even the Fearow and Primeape he had seen before all the territorial bosses were exceptionally large. He had previously assumed they were just stronger, and that it was normal for Pokémon in this era to be bigger than what the Pokédex recorded, so he hadn't given it much thought. Now, it seemed there really was an alpha system among wild Pokémon. Whoa, Goldie, you look super powerful now, Liz circled Will several times, her big eyes shining so brightly you could almost see stars in them. Just as Will was about to speak, he smelled something strange. Along with the odd smell came a black, acrid, choking smoke. Raticate. The Beedrill swarm's #1 lackey, the Raticate, came scrambling over with his 2 little wives in tow. But that wasn't all. A large number of other Pokémon followed behind him. Pokémon that would normally prey on each other and compete for resources were now ignoring one another, all just single-mindedly running in this direction. What? How can the forest be on fire? Did some idiot fire type get careless? Hearing what the Raticate was squeaking about, Will lost his composure. A forest fire was a natural disaster for Pokémon like them who lived in the forest. It was more terrifying than a storm or an earthquake. It should be fine, right? The water-type Pokémon should be able to handle it. Will's heart began to race. It was his first time experiencing something like this as a Pokémon. But logically, the number of water types in the forest should be greater than the number of fire types. Not to mention the rock and ground types. Extinguishing a fire should be no problem. However, from the looks of it, the situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. The Pokémon had no intention of fighting the fire. Instead, they were frantically fleeing deeper into the forest. Something seems to be driving them. Will focused his gaze in the direction the Pokémon were coming from. He thought he saw human figures? It's the people from the Sylph tribe. They're the ones who set the fire. This is outrageous. Without the forest, how will everyone survive? Goldie, hurry, lead everyone away. Liz recognized the figures at a glance and began jumping up and down anxiously, urging Will to get everyone to flee. Chapter 16, Death. The Sylph tribe. Will couldn't believe these people were so insane. To be blunt, not just Pokémon, but humans too, could not afford to lose the forest. And yet, these people had set it on fire without a second thought. Either they were truly mad, or they were confident they could stop the fire from spreading, or even extinguish it entirely. They must have found out Liz is here. It's okay, as long as they see Liz run in a different direction, they won't hurt you, Goldie. You guys have to run. Liz finished speaking and immediately turned, intending to run towards the Sylph tribesmen. The child planned to lead them away and naively believed she could actually escape. Wally, Millie, take everyone and flee to the middle ring of the forest. Wait for me to come back. Will scanned the forest ahead, then snatched up Liz, who was already starting to scramble away. The number of people they had sent was far greater than what they could see. No matter which direction Liz ran, she would not be able to escape. Looks like this was planned. Were we discovered sometime in the last few days? Will had a rough idea of what was happening. The Sylph tribe was too well prepared for this to be a coincidence. Goldie? Why are you holding me? Why aren't you leaving? Liz struggled as she saw the figures of the Sylph tribesmen drawing closer. She grew even more panicked when she saw Wally and Millie obeying Will's orders and heading deeper into the forest, while Will himself seemed to have been left behind. Could it be? Could Goldie have broken with his own family and partners for my sake? An overwhelming sense of gratitude filled Liz's heart, and fat tears began to stream down her face. What is this kid imagining now? Will thought. The smoke wasn't thick enough to be making her eyes water yet. But he had no time to ponder such things. He clutched Liz, shot straight up into the sky, and flew out over the top of the forest. He was going to carry Liz over MT Silver and get her back to the vicinity of the Dragonite tribe. Don't. Goldie, don't fly so high. They have arrows. Liz's face went pale when she saw Will fly so high into the open sky. What? How far can humans shoot arrows? They can't possibly hit us from this height. Will shook his head, thinking Liz was worrying too much. Beedrill's speed stat wasn't exceptionally high, but it could fly, and he was no ordinary Beedrill. In this tribal period of the era of primal beasts, human weaponry was likely limited to bows, crossbows, and spears, right? That shouldn't pose a threat to him. Fwoosh! 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 XN. Just as he was thinking this, a multitude of sharp, whistling sounds shot up from below. He instinctively looked down. A dozen iron-tipped arrows were heading straight for them. Will's face fell. He clutched Liz and abruptly accelerated, narrowly dodging the arrows. How are they so fast? Not even a crossbow should have that kind of power. Will frowned and looked down. What he saw through a gap in the canopy below left him stunned. These primitive humans weren't using crossbows, they were using the even more ancient bow. Can a human fire an arrow like that with just a bow? The question filled his mind. He had no time to think. He flew towards the outside of the forest at full speed. He realized he had severely underestimated the humans of the Pokémon world. More accurately, he had underestimated the humans of the era of primal beasts. Damn it, how could I forget? The fact that humans could suppress and command Pokémon with military force in the later Kingdom period means they must have been incredibly strong. And that's not even counting the existence of special ability users, like those with aura or psychic powers. Will suddenly regretted sending Wally and Millie away. He had thought he could handle it all on his own, that a larger group would just be a bigger target. But now it seemed he had made a fatal error in judgment. But there was no turning back. The Sylph tribe had locked onto them. If they turned back now, the fire would only spread deeper into the forest, and countless weak Pokémon would die. Fwoosh! 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 Another volley of countless arrows shot towards them. Will weaved left and right in the air, carrying Liz. Fortunately, a child didn't weigh much and didn't affect his flight speed too badly. Moreover, Liz wasn't screaming or struggling in a panic. Instead, she was calmly telling him where the people below were, and when they were attacking. The flight out of the forest was fraught with peril, but they made it without injury. Yet Will's expression was anything but relieved. He had fallen into a situation with a wolf at his back and a tiger at his front. Pidgeot. Ahead of them, a Pidgeot with a 3-meter wingspan swooped in. It clearly intended to make a meal out of this big, fat bug. The Pidgeot was also startled when it first saw Will. Living on the plains, it had never seen such a gigantic insect. But after its initial shock, it grew eager, its eyes glinting with a vicious light. How could it possibly let such a plump meal that had delivered itself to its doorstep get away? Goldie. What do we do? Liz had obviously noticed their hopeless situation. A massive Pidgeot blocked their path in the air, while 30 or 40 burly humans were in hot pursuit on the ground below. Is this how it ends? Will no longer knew what to do. Pidgeot. The Pidgeot in front attacked first. It used a combination of agility and wing attack, striking Will from above. The flying type move dealt massive damage to him. The blow left Will dizzy and disoriented, and he began to plummet towards the grasslands below, still clutching Liz. Fwoosh! 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 As if things weren't bad enough, another dozen arrows shot up from below. The Pidgeot flew back, narrowly dodging them. It looked between Will and the dozens of humans, let out a frustrated cry, and then flew away. Goldie! Dodge! Liz's anxious voice cried out. But Will's body felt like it was falling apart, aching all over. That Pidgeot must be at least LV40. Will cursed his bad luck. Even with a type disadvantage, one hit shouldn't have injured him this badly. If that Pidgeot had hit him one more time, he would likely be on the brink of death. Though, he was pretty much there already. He used all his strength to dodge left and right in midair, but his movements were no longer as agile. Now, without the forest canopy to obstruct the archer's view, 3 more arrows pierced his body. One went through a wing. Another shattered one of his thin, brittle legs. The last one struck him directly in the abdomen, the arrowhead embedding itself deep inside. I'm going to die. Will's vision went black. He couldn't hold on any longer and plunged headfirst towards the ground. But even as his consciousness faded, he instinctively flapped his wings a couple of times to cushion their fall. He and Liz landed together, rolling across the grass. They're here. This child is probably going to die here too. Hearing the sound of many footsteps approaching, Will no longer had the strength to struggle. It was a shame. Liz was just an 8 or 9-year-old girl, and her young life was about to be cut short here. As for him. Goldie, why did you do it? Their target was me. You should have just thrown me away, right? Liz's choked sobs were endless. She pushed at Will's body. Even a child could understand that his injuries were fatal. Her tribe had no medicine man skilled enough to heal such wounds. How could I ever do something like abandon a kid? Back in high school, my friends would have looked down on me for doing something like that. As his consciousness dissipated, all sorts of random thoughts began to surface in Will's mind. Thinking and thinking, he finally remembered. He wasn't a Beedrill at all. He was just an ordinary young man who had just come of age. Being a Beedrill isn't fun at all. I wish I had been reborn in the era of leagues. At least then it wouldn't have been so hard. Or maybe, I was just looking for a reason to die. Chapter 17, Epilogue to the First Life. Will was completely unaware of what happened afterward. Just as Liz believed she too was about to die, she discovered that the first to arrive were not the enemy Sylph tribesmen, but members of her own Dragonite tribe. Princess! Get away from that primal beast! Please, step back! These damned people, setting fire to the forest! How despicable and shameless! Get them! The warriors of the Dragonite tribe gave chase to the Sylph tribesmen without a second thought. Liz merely glanced up once before her gaze returned to the lifeless body of the Beedrill. Later, the members of the Sylph tribe fled in disarray, and the flames in the forest were extinguished by the Pokémon. Liz had the Beedrill's body brought back to the tribe and given a proper burial. A week later, Liz left the Dragonite tribe once again. This time, about 30 people followed her. Their objective was clear: to venture into MT Silver and find the Beedrill swarm that Will had built. It had taken Liz a full week to persuade her father to trust her, to trust Goldie. No matter what, she could not fail on this mission. She would bring the power of the Beedrill back to the Dragonite tribe. And then, she would unify the entire region. In the forest. Princess, please be careful. There are many primal beasts around here. It's fine. I've seen most of these beasts before. They shouldn't dare to touch me. Liz was quite confident about this. Goldie had been famous in this area, many Pokémon would hide the moment they saw him. Although she had only spent a short time with the Beedrill swarm, many of the local Pokémon already knew about the strange new member in their ranks. Liz led her clansmen all the way to the grove of trees where she had first lived with the swarm. However, she saw no sign of any Beedrill or Weedle. She even climbed a tree and scanned the surroundings, but still saw nothing. Just as Liz was feeling lost, her gaze flashed towards the deeper part of the forest. She remembered that on the day Goldie had carried her away, the other Beedrill had flown deeper into the woods. We need to go deeper into the forest. We can't, Princess. We were already incredibly lucky to have made it this far unscathed. If we go deeper into the forest, we'll have no chance of coming out alive. One of the guards quickly stepped forward to stop her. The deeper parts of the forest had always been a forbidden zone for humans. Only the strongest warriors, those with special powers, were qualified to explore there. With only 30 of them, they would likely be annihilated before they even found the beasts they were looking for. It was no different from seeking death. True, with so many people, we're too big a target. In that case, you all head back first. I'll go by myself. X30. The members of the Dragonite tribe fell silent. The laws of survival and the social structure of this era were harsh and unforgiving. If they, the guards, abandoned their princess and returned to the tribe alone, it would be a death sentence. They had no choice. Since going back was also death, they could only risk their lives to accompany their lord. If Liz truly did manage to ally with some primal beasts to fight for the Dragonite tribe, then the other princes and princesses would no longer have any hope of claiming the chieftain's seat. At that time, they who had accompanied Liz into the forest would be hailed as founding heroes, the elder statesmen of a new court. With this mindset, the group pressed on into the deeper regions of MT Silver. A month passed in the blink of an eye. 5 or 6 humans, looking as disheveled as primitive cavemen, emerged from the forest. At their head was a small, pale-faced girl. Behind her, in addition to the 5 other humans, was a swarm of primal beasts, 15 Beedrill and 34 Weedle. Leading them was a new alpha Beedrill, about 3.5 meters tall with exceptionally brilliant coloring. It was the new leader of the Beedrill swarm, Wally. Besides these Pokémon, more than 20 Cocoon remained in the forest, not yet brought out. They would organize another expedition later to transport them. When Liz returned to the Dragonite tribe with so many primal beasts, everyone was electrified. They gradually came to accept Liz's claim, primal beasts can be commanded. They can become our powerful fighting force. Time flowed like water. 10 years passed since Liz returned to the Dragonite tribe with the Beedrill. In those 10 years, with the power of the Beedrill clan, the Dragonite tribe grew stronger and stronger. One by one, the small surrounding tribes were devoured and merged. The Dragonite tribe became the largest in the entire Johto region, with a population of over 50,000. In the year Liz turned 18, she rightfully became the new chieftain of the Dragonite tribe. By this time, there were already over 500 beast callers in the tribe, people who could command the primal beasts. They followed the methods Liz taught them, befriending weak beasts with food, then bringing them back to the tribe to be raised and strengthened. Alternatively, they would steal the eggs of primal beasts, bring them back to hatch, and cultivate a bond from the very beginning. This method became more and more refined. In the future, beast callers would inevitably appear on a massive scale. It might even be possible for everyone to become one. After becoming the new chieftain, Liz further began to utilize the various powers of the primal beasts. These were all lessons she had learned from Goldie. For example, using flying beasts to transport goods, or having some beasts assist in farming and mining, but of course, the main use was to commit the power of the beasts to warfare. Another 10 years passed. The old Dragonite tribe was gone. Individual tribes had almost completely disappeared from the Johto region. There was now only one newly established nation, which called itself the Dragonite Kingdom. The ruler of this nation was the 28-year-old Queen Liz. At this point, the first half of the era of primal beasts, the tribal period, came to a close, and the second half, the kingdom period, began. The struggle for resources between humans and beasts was no longer the main conflict. Ordinary primal beasts could no longer threaten the powerful Dragonite kingdom. The main conflict now was the struggle for resources and the conquest of land between humans. In the region on the other side of MT Silver, a nation called the Kingdom of the Land had risen to power, mimicking the Dragonite kingdom's methods of harnessing the power of beasts. Because the massive MT Silver stood between them, the Dragonite kingdom had always known very little about the happenings in the other region, and they were unwilling to risk crossing the dangerous mountain. But now, things were different. In a mountain range adjacent to MT Silver, a great road had appeared, connecting the Kanto and Johto regions. The road looked as if it had been plowed out by some colossal beast. But the details didn't matter. What mattered was that from the moment this road appeared, the Dragonite kingdom and the Kingdom of the Land, who had never interfered with each other, could no longer remain at peace. Facing the impending war between the two nations, Liz, her heart heavy with worry, decided to visit MT Silver with Wally and Millie. She wanted to see the place where Goldie was born. Chapter 18, Second Life, Reborn as a Pseudo-Legendary. Mew, am I dead? And if so, how do I still have consciousness? Will had no idea what his current situation was. 1 second, his body was in extreme, agonizing pain, and even breathing was a struggle. The next, he couldn't feel anything at all. No, that's not right. Will frowned, sensing that something was off. It wasn't that he couldn't feel anything. In fact, he could clearly feel a cool sensation all over his body, as if he were submerged in water. He opened his eyes. A dim space appeared before him. A few fish swam leisurely past his face. Some of the smaller ones even swam up to nuzzle against him. Beside him, he could see aquatic plants swaying gently in the water. Will blinked. He stared blankly as a massive, 2-meter-long Magikarp swam past him. Will. Mew? Didn't I die? Will distinctly remembered suffering fatal wounds. So why, when he opened his eyes, was he suddenly at the bottom of a lake or an ocean? And why did it feel like he could breathe underwater? That's right, the status screen. Will suddenly remembered his interface and quickly called it out. Dratini. Potential, blue. Level, 1. Type, dragon. Ability, shed skin. Height, 1m. Weight, 1.5 kilograms. Moves, focus energy, inherited, rap, leer. Dratini. Me. I'm a pseudo-legendary. Will's expression went from utter confusion to sheer brilliance, a wave of delight washing over his bewilderment. The final evolution of a Dratini was Dragonite, the pseudo-legendary Pokémon of the Kanto region. The Dragonite line was the very Pokémon that the Dragonite tribe had revered for generations. A Dratini looked like a blue serpent with a white pacifier in its mouth, though that wasn't a pacifier but its nose. Its large eyes and the 2 white fins on its head made it look incredibly cute. But he quickly calmed down and realized the potential problems. Wait, does this mean I can reincarnate infinitely? It seems that way for now. But no matter what, this life is a golden start. Will now had a rough idea of what his special ability was. It was likely infinite reincarnation. He used the word likely because he had only been reborn twice so far. He would need at least one more reincarnation to be certain of his ability. But regardless, starting this life as a pseudo-legendary was a fantastic turn of events. He still hadn't forgotten the despair he felt in his past life upon discovering he was a Weedle. No, that's not right. If I'm still in the era of primal beasts, then this might be even worse than being a Weedle. Suddenly, a thought struck him, and he latched onto the key issue. Pseudo-legendary Pokémon were all, without exception, late bloomers. Even for the Dragonite line, you needed to reach the second stage, Dragonair, to have any real self-preservation ability, and that required evolving at around LV30. In his past life, his Beedrill had only reached LV30 in its entire lifetime, though that lifetime had been less than 2 months long. A Weedle only needed to reach around LV10 to evolve into a Beedrill. It could reach its final stage in just 10 days, gaining the ability to fly and escape threats on the ground. A low level wasn't a major issue then. But a Dratini was basically stuck in the water until it evolved into a Dragonair. While it could survive on land, its movement was extremely clumsy, not much better than a Weedle's. According to the Pokédex, a Dratini was so pathetic that it had to live hidden at the bottom of deep water, surviving on whatever sank down to it. By the way, who did I inherit focus energy from? Can the Dragonite line even learn this move? Will stared at the inherited move, lost in thought. He was sure that Dragonite couldn't learn focus energy, yet there it was in his skill list. Could it be, inherited from my past life? Will was startled by his own idea. If that were true, it would mean that the more he reincarnated, the stronger he would become. But even so, he had no desire to keep dying. The feeling of those arrows piercing him in his last life was excruciating. He hoped that this time, he could live a full life and die of old age. Or even better, not die at all. He had to play it safe. Let's see. Will carefully peeked out from the bottom of the water, looking up at the Pokémon swimming above. They were mostly Magikarp, with the occasional Goldeen passing by. After observing them, Will got a good sense of his situation. There was good news, and there was bad news. The bad news was that he was probably still in the era of primal beasts, because every Pokémon he saw was far larger than the average recorded in the Pokédex. The good news was that he was likely in a small lake. The variety of water-type Pokémon was very monotonous, and they were all friendly species like Magikarp and Goldeen, who had weak territorial instincts and weren't aggressive. There was no shortage of food, either. The small lake was teeming with tiny fish, shrimp, and plankton. His current living situation was actually quite good. Thank goodness. It would be a huge problem if there were dangerous Pokémon here. There's nowhere to run in a place like this, Will sighed in relief. He tried to move forward and found it surprisingly difficult. Although both were long-bodied creatures, a Dragone's method of movement was completely different from a Weedle's. On land, a Weedle moved by arching its back up and down. In the water, a Dragone moved by swaying its entire body from side to side. The movement felt awkward to Will, but that was a minor issue. After about 5 minutes of strenuous swimming, he reached the edge of the lake. He swam up along the wall, quickly approaching the surface. He needed to see where this lake was located. If it was on a plain, it would be more dangerous, but if it was in a forest, it would be much safer. Splash! Will popped his head out of the water. The first thing that greeted him was a large, dopey-looking face. In that instant, Will's breath caught in his throat. He immediately turned to dive back down, but he wasn't fast enough. A hand shot out and scooped him up. Yes, a hand. What had caught him was a good-sized Poliwhirl. Polly, hello. Just as Will was bracing himself to be eaten in one bite, he froze. That voice. He looked at the Poliwhirl before him. He couldn't make out any distinguishing features, he was face-blind when it came to Pokémon. If Wally and Millie were in front of him at the same time, he could only tell them apart by their voices and sizes. Right now, Will recognized this Poliwhirl's voice as being strangely familiar. That Poliwag. He's already evolved into a Poliwhirl. Will looked around but couldn't deduce anything else. Unfortunately, he couldn't use the Poliwhirl to judge how much time had passed since his death as a Beedrill. A Poliwhirl needed a King's Rock or a Water Stone to evolve. Those conditions were extremely harsh for a wild Pokémon, and they wouldn't even know they needed such items to begin with. This Poliwhirl could have evolved yesterday, or it could have been in this form for 70 or 80 years. But no matter what, Will was sure of one thing, the time that had passed since his death was likely not too long. Probably not more than 100 years. If it had been longer than that, he likely wouldn't be seeing this Poliwhirl at all. A Pokémon's lifespan was related to its type, strength, and species. And based on this Poliwhirl's current state, it didn't look like it could live for a particularly long time. Chapter 19, Adopted by the Queen. The Poliwhirl seemed to just be curious, as it had never seen a Pokémon like Will before. After a brief greeting, it placed Will back into the lake. Are you the boss of this territory? This time, Will didn't rush to dive back into the water but instead turned to ask the Poliwhirl. Yep, the Poliwhirl nodded. This didn't surprise Will. After all, the Poliwhirl was massive, standing a full 3 meters tall. That was 3 times the size recorded in the Pokédex, an exaggerated height that surely came from an alpha bonus. Then how long have you been the boss? I don't know. A long time. Will froze. He had forgotten that wild Pokémon had no concept of time. They had no idea how many days or years had passed. In fact, even his own sense of time had become much blurrier, he could only judge its passage by the changing of the sky. Will thought for a moment and decided to go ashore to have a look himself. He just needed to move slowly along the riverbank. The Sylph tribe had started a fire near here once. He just needed to find traces of that fire to get a rough idea of how much time had passed. Can you help me get up there? Will asked the Poliwhirl. Sure, the Poliwhirl nodded, scooped Will up again, and placed him on the ground. Returning to land, Will felt a little uncomfortable. A Dratini's skin was probably too delicate, it would start to dry out after leaving the water. It was fine for a short period, but staying out of the water for too long would likely cause problems. This wasn't an issue for Will, however, as he only intended to look around the immediate vicinity. After giving the Poliwhirl a nod of thanks, Will began to slowly wriggle forward along the bank. He squirmed for a good 10 minutes and had only advanced a dozen or so meters. But those dozen meters were enough for him to make a judgment. The lake he had been reborn in was the same small lake that bordered his old territory. He just didn't know who that territory belonged to now. If it still belonged to his companions from his past life, then perhaps he could become the boss again in this Dratini body. But he felt the chances of that were extremely low. Because as he scanned his surroundings, he couldn't see a single trace of a fire. This meant that a not insignificant amount of time had passed since that great fire, at least a matter of years. He now suspected that Wally, Millie, and the others might already be dead. After all, the average lifespan of bug-type Pokémon was very short. Even a champion-level bug-type might only live for 100 or 200 years. Pokémon like Turtwig, Squirtle, Torkoal, and Turtuga had lifespans of hundreds of years from the moment they were born, not to mention ghost and psychic types. So, he highly doubted he would ever see his old followers again in this life. Sigh. Hey, hey, hey. Just as Will was sighing by the shore, looking out at the lake, he suddenly felt something pick him up, giving him a huge scare. Will struggled frantically, trying to dive back into the lake, but at his low level, he had almost no strength and was held tightly, unable to move. You! Will thought he was about to start over again. He angrily turned his head, ready to see which little punk dared to be so disrespectful to him, the great Beedrill boss. But when he turned, he froze. Before him was a mature, beautiful face. But that wasn't what stunned him. What stunned him was that the face looked so incredibly familiar. Little one, what are you doing here all alone? Are you in a bad mood? This is my first time seeing you in this forest. The woman, who had the gentle air of a loving wife, reached out and softly stroked the small white fin on Will's head, then couldn't help but break into a smile. Who are you? Hiss. Why do you feel so familiar? Could you be an NPC I saw in a game? No, that's not right, the games never had content for the Johto region during the era of primal beasts. Will frowned, looking at the woman before him. Bzz. Suddenly, his ears twitched. He heard a sound that was more familiar than anything else. The sound of a Beedrill's flapping wings. Will turned his head to look behind the woman. 4 Beedrill floated silently in the air. Each one was 3 meters tall, matching the final physique he had achieved in his past life. These 4 Beedrill are very high level. They definitely can't be the leader of their own swarm, so their levels must be at least 40, maybe even higher. Will made an instant judgment. My name is Liz of the Dragonite, Queen of the Dragonite Kingdom. You're such a cute little thing. Come home with me. Liz was so charmed by Will's antics that she decided to take this little primal beast back to the palace with her. She had seen pretty much every Pokémon on MT Silver. The cuter ones were Pokémon like Pikachu, Nidorina, and Vulpix, but none of them had truly captured her heart. Only this little beast in her arms seemed to perfectly match her sense of aesthetics. Its every move was adorable. Even its soft, sweet voice was unbearably cute to her ears. Liz. Will the Dratini was completely dumbfounded. He never thought that the little girl from back then had actually survived, let alone become the queen of the Dragonite tribe. No, it should be the queen of the Dragonite kingdom now. Has the world already entered the kingdom period? No wonder Liz has Beedrill following her. Humans must have learned how to command the power of Pokémon by now. Although the relationship between humans and Pokémon still isn't great, the main theme of this era should be war between humans. Will lowered his head, his mind racing as he analyzed the current situation. He didn't even notice that Liz had already stood up and was carrying him out of the forest. By the time Will felt the gentle breeze of the plains, it was too late. But it didn't matter. In his opinion, becoming the queen's Pokémon and growing up under her protection would allow him to pass through his vulnerable Dratini stage in peace and security. He might even be able to safely grow all the way to his final Dragonite stage. At that point, as a pseudo-legendary with a level of 50 or higher, he might not be invincible, but at least he wouldn't have to worry about being killed by humans again. By the way, how did I not see back then that this dirt-covered village girl had such good looks? Will turned his head to look at Liz, who was holding him. Liz returned his gaze with a gentle smile. Her fiery red, curly hair, a trademark of the Dragonite family, combined with her fair skin and gentle eyes, was a stark contrast to the little girl from back then. It was no wonder Will hadn't recognized her at first, no one would have believed it. Now then, I should give you a name, Liz said, frowning in serious thought as she held Will. 5 seconds later. I'll call you Lan. Lan? I knew you couldn't come up with a good name. I hope you don't insist on changing it when you see me evolve into an orange Dragonite, Will thought, shaking his head in resignation. He didn't know that he had mistaken the name. Chapter 20, The Queen's Darling. As Liz carried Will into the Dragonite Kingdom, he had to admit that he had severely underestimated the speed of human development in this era. Will had assumed this so-called kingdom would be nothing more than a large fortress made of ugly, grey stones. He was wrong. While the Dragonite Kingdom was certainly not as advanced or luxurious as the cities of the future, it was far from the primitive image Will had in his mind. It was more like a town from medieval Europe. The streets and alleys were relatively clean, with almost no signs of filth or squalor. And Queen Liz herself was not the high and mighty ruler depicted in movies and anime, completely detached from her people. She walked freely through the streets holding Will, casually greeting the common folk on either side of the road. The people, in turn, did not react with fanatical worship, nor did they rush forward to ask for autographs. They simply offered her warm greetings. It was Will, however, who drew all the attention. This little primal beast, held personally in the arms of the Queen, caused everyone to turn and stare, successfully achieving a 100% head turn rate. First time seeing a Dratini, hey? Ha ha ha. Will was quite enjoying being the center of attention. Most Dratini lived hidden in the dark depths of the water, only emerging after they evolved into Dragonair and gained the ability to fly and protect themselves. As such, a Dratini was an incredibly rare Pokémon, not just in the era of primal beasts, but even in the far more peaceful era of leagues, where it was considered a mirage Pokémon. But Will was mistaken. For the common people living in the Dragonite Kingdom, there were countless Pokémon they had never seen before. They couldn't recognize how rare Will was, unlike Liz. The reason they paid him so much attention was simply that it was the first time they had ever seen their queen be so intimate with a primal beast. For the past 20 years, Liz had never had contact with any beast other than those of the Beedrill line, typically entrusting their training to her close ministers and subordinates. Will was the very first beast to be allowed so close to Queen Liz. They continued on their way. Soon, Will saw the castle where he would be living for a very long time. It was a beautiful and luxurious structure, its entire exterior a pure white, with the tops of its towers formed by yellow spires. Your Majesty! Why are you holding a primal beast? Please, put it down at once. Be careful, it might attack you. Shortly after they entered the castle, a tall woman with long, straight black hair, dressed in a traditional French maid's uniform, hurried over, her expression stern. Hestia, it's all right. Lan is very gentle, Liz smiled, not paying her concern much mind. She even reached down and playfully pinched Will's tail. This action made Hestia's eyebrow twitch. She anxiously jumped in front of Liz, snatched Will away, and dropped him on the floor. What they? Dropped on the hard floor, Will saw stars, his head spinning. When he came to, he glared furiously at Hestia. Hestia! How could you treat him like that? Lan is still a baby. Liz's face darkened. She rushed over, picked Will up, and carefully inspected him for injuries. She was no longer the young girl who knew nothing about primal beasts. She knew that all beasts went through an infant stage. During this period, they were extremely fragile, so weak that even a full power attack was like a gentle, playful scratch. But the moment they left that stage, even if only for 5 seconds, they would possess immense strength. When Liz had first picked Will up by the lake and felt his struggles, she knew instantly that he was still an infant. This was why she dared to hold him so fearlessly, without worrying about being attacked. Your Majesty! Say no more. I have already decided to raise Lan. When he grows up, he will be my most important partner, as important as Goldie. Liz's attitude was resolute. She had always believed that her encounter with this little beast was no coincidence. The moment she first laid eyes on him, a stir in her heart told her that this child was a beast partner she could absolutely trust. It was a feeling no other beast had ever given her, not once in 20 years. She didn't know where the feeling came from, but she trusted it. This, very well. But please, your majesty, you must be careful. Hearing this, Hestia could only nod helplessly. When she heard Liz invoke the name Goldie, she knew the matter was no longer up for debate. Goldie. That name held an extraordinary significance throughout the Dragonite Kingdom. It was a name recorded in the annals of the Dragonite tribe's history, a defining stroke in the Queen's own story, the crowning touch in the founding of the Dragonite Kingdom. Hestia's next actions were decisive and efficient. Since Her Majesty had decided to personally raise this beast, then they must naturally provide the most perfect methods of care. For the entire day, none of the maids in the royal palace got a moment's rest. There were countless things they needed to prepare and research. For example, what kind of living environment does Lan prefer? What flavors of food does Lan like? What kind of toys does Lan enjoy? What elements is Lan afraid of? These were all things they had to study and observe, bit by bit, all to raise Her Majesty's personal beast into a powerful, independent partner as quickly and perfectly as possible. This child probably likes to live in water. Move a large tank into my chambers. Remember to change the water with fresh, clear water every day, Liz said, holding Will. She remembered finding Lan by the lake, and his body had been very moist, clearly having just come out of the water. So she guessed he would like a place with water. Oh my life is about to get so good, Will thought, lying comfortably in Liz's arms, leisurely watching the beautiful maids bustle about for his sake. He could already imagine the lavish, happy life he was about to lead. Finally, he wouldn't have to struggle so hard like he did in his first life. He didn't even have to wait for the next day. On the very evening he arrived at the palace, news that the Queen had a new darling pet had already spread through all the major taverns in the capital. It wouldn't be long before the news spread throughout the entire Dragonite Kingdom, and perhaps the entire Johto region. But at this moment, Will didn't care about any of that. Because night had fallen, and he was now lying on the Queen's massive bed. So, what was the point of preparing that giant tank for me? Will thought, looking speechlessly at Liz, who was hugging him so tightly he thought he might be strangled. At the same time, he glanced covetously at the large glass tank by the bed. Under the moonlight, the crystal-clear glass tank shone with a beautiful light, and the rippling water within looked so inviting. Will couldn't even imagine how comfortable his skin would feel after a swim in there. It was his first time being a Dratini, and he didn't know what would happen if he stayed out of water for too long, but he was sure it would be an unpleasant experience. But Lan, be good and sleep now, don't fidget. Good night. Liz didn't know why, but she just wanted to sleep while holding Will. The feeling gave her a sense of nostalgia, just like how she felt sleeping next to Goldie 20 years ago. The only difference was that sleeping on a hard tree trunk back then had been very uncomfortable, whereas this soft, luxurious bed was so much better. Mew, good night.
Thanks for listening.